She was lying in the dirt, blood in her mouth, 2,000 miles from anyone who knew her name. Three men had just beaten her in broad daylight. A whole town watched. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. She was about to close her eyes and let go when she heard hoofbeats. Not one horse. Three. And a voice she had never heard before said 5 words that would change everything. You'll stand with us. This is the story of how a broken woman and 3 mountain brothers built a family out of ashes and burned down every lie the world had ever told them about what they were worth. The dust of Elk Ridge ran red that August afternoon in 1873. Not from drought, not from the copper earth that gave these mountain roads their color. From blood. Wren Ashford's blood. They beat her in broad daylight while good people looked away. Their silence dressed up as caution. 3 men, 1 woman, no mercy, until the sound of hoofbeats changed everything. Not one horse, 3. Until 3 shadows blocked the sun, and a voice rough as mountain granite spoke words that would reshape 4 broken lives. You'll stand with us. This is their story. Before we continue, if you're new here, hit subscribe. I share New Frontier stories every week. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. Let's see how far this tale travels. Now, let us go back. 18 days before the blood, 18 days before the dust, 18 days before Wren Ashford learned what it meant to fall and what it meant to be lifted up by hands she had never touched and hearts she had never known. Let us begin at the beginning. The stagecoach climbed. It had been climbing for hours, lurching and swaying up switchback trails that grew narrower with every mile, the wheels finding every rut and stone in the ancient road, as if guided by spite. The interior smelled of old leather and dust and the faintest trace of tobacco from whoever had ridden in this seat before her. Through the window, the landscape tilted and shifted the dry valley floor, giving way to stands of dark pine, the air thinning and sharpening until each breath tasted of resin and cold water and something else, something wild, something untouched. Wren Ashford sat alone on the worn bench seat, her carpet bag clutched in her lap, and tried to remember how to breathe without shaking. She was 23 years old. She owned 2 changes of clothes, her mother's Bible, a daguerreotype of her parents taken the year before they died, and a letter. The letter was the most important thing. She had read it so many times the paper had gone soft at the folds, the ink smudged by anxious fingers that returned to it again and again the way a drowning person returns to the surface for air. The advertisement had appeared in the Boston Herald, tucked between notices for patent medicine and farm equipment in a newspaper someone had left on a park bench. She had almost walked past it, almost left it there in the rain, but something made her stop. Something made her read the small block of text that would change the entire course of her life. Wife sought for the Thornton homestead, a good Christian woman of strong character willing to build a life in mountain country. Inquire by letter to E. Thornton, Elk Ridge, Colorado Territory. She had written that night, written by candlelight in the narrow room she shared with the brooms and the mending basket in her Aunt Prudence's house in Boston, the house where she had lived for 7 years. As something between a niece and a servant, never quite one thing or the other, always reminded that she occupied space she had not earned and consumed food she had not paid for. Her parents had died of cholera when she was 15. Both of them within 3 days of each other, as if even death could not separate them. Her father had been a school teacher. Her mother had played piano at the church on Sundays and sang hymns that made the congregation weep. They had not been wealthy. They had not been important. They had simply been good, and then they were gone, and Wren was left alone in a world that had no particular use for a 15-year-old girl, with no dowry and no connections and no one to speak for her. Aunt Prudence took her in, not out of love. Prudence Ashford had no love to spare, having used up whatever supplies she possessed on a husband who died owing money to half of Boston. She took Wren in because it was expected, because the church ladies would have talked, because having a niece to do the cooking and the cleaning and the mending was cheaper than hiring a girl from the agency. 7 years. 7 years of scrubbed floors and pressed linens and meals conjured from whatever the butcher had discounted that day. 7 years of hearing every single morning the same bitter litany. You eat my food, you sleep under my roof. You contribute nothing of value. 7 years of being told that no decent man would ever want her, that she was plain, that she was odd, that she read too much and talked too little, and had ideas above her station. And then the letter came back from E. Thornton. The handwriting was strong and clear. The words were surprisingly literate, even poetic, carrying a kind of quiet intelligence that made her read certain sentences 2 and 3 times, turning them over in her mind like stones from a riverbed, examining their weight and shape and hidden beauty. He wrote about mountains, about solitude, about the belief that true strength comes not from the absence of hardship, but from the refusal to be diminished by it. He wrote about loneliness without self-pity, about loss, without bitterness, about hope, as a practical necessity rather than a romantic indulgence. She fell in love with those letters before she ever fell in love with the man who wrote them, or rather, with the men. But she did not know that yet. She left Boston on a Tuesday morning. Aunt Prudence's parting words followed her down the street like stray dogs. "You'll be back within the month, mark my words. No man in his right mind would keep you." Wren had $12 remaining, not enough to buy passage home even if she wanted to return, which she did not. She would rather face whatever waited at the Thornton homestead than spend another day being told she was worthless by a woman who had never once looked at her and seen anything worth keeping. The stagecoach driver called out that they were approaching Elk Ridge. Wren peered through the dusty window and saw a small mountain town clinging to the side of a valley. Wooden buildings lined a main street of packed dirt. Pine-covered mountains rose on all sides, their peaks still holding the last of the winter snow, even in August. It was beautiful in the way that wild things are beautiful. Terrifying in the way that the unknown is always terrifying. She was 2,000 miles from the only world she had ever known about to meet a man she had never seen, to begin a life she could not imagine. The stagecoach lurched to a stop. Wren gathered her carpetbag, smoothed her navy blue traveling dress as best she could, and stepped down onto the wooden platform in front of the general store. The sign above the door read, "Mercer's Mercantile," in faded gold letters. The mountain air hit her like a wall, thin, cold, sharp with pine resin, and the mineral smell of rock and running water. So different from the heavy salt air of Boston that for a moment she felt dizzy, as if she had stepped not just off a stagecoach but off the edge of the world itself. She looked around for whoever was supposed to meet her. The street was quiet. A few people moved about their business, giving her curious glances, but no welcome. No smile, no wave, no man stepping forward with his hat in his hands and hope in his eyes. 10 minutes passed. 20, 30. The dizziness became something else, something colder, something that crept up from her stomach and wrapped around her chest and whispered in Aunt Prudence's voice, "No man in his right mind would keep you." Had E. Thornton changed his mind? Had the letter gone astray? Was she stranded in a mountain town at the end of the earth with no money, no prospects, and no way home? Wren made a decision. She would go inside the general store and ask about the Thornton Ranch. She was not going to stand on this platform like a piece of unclaimed freight. She was not going to let the silence of this town make her small. She pushed open the door and stepped inside. The store smelled of coffee beans and leather and coal oil. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with the necessities of frontier life: canned goods, ammunition, fabric tools, rope soap. Behind the counter stood a young man a few years older than her, 27 or 28, with a handsome face, spoiled by an expression of permanent entitlement. His hair was oiled, his shirt was clean. His eyes traveled over her the way a horse trader's eyes travel over livestock, assessing value and finding it lacking. This was Dalton Mercer, son of the store's owner, a young man whose sense of entitlement exceeded his intelligence by a considerable margin. "Help you," he said, and even those two words carried a weight of assumption that made Wren's skin crawl. "I'm looking for the Thornton homestead," she said quietly. "I was told someone would meet me here." Dalton's expression shifted. Something ugly entered his eyes, something amused and predatory, like a cat watching a mouse that does not yet know it has been seen. "The Thornton place, those mountain savages." He laughed, showing white teeth. "Lady, you must be lost. Nobody goes up that mountain on purpose." Two more men entered the store behind her. Wren heard their boots on the wooden floor, felt their presence like a change in air pressure. Virgil Pope, lean and mean, eyed with the practiced cruelty of a man who enjoyed causing pain. Lyle Dawson, soft-chinned and dull, the kind of man who followed because he lacked the imagination to lead. They flanked Dalton with the ease of longtime companions, and the three of them formed a wall between Wren and the door. Dalton told her the Thorntons were trouble. that they were squatting on land that belonged to proper citizens, that they were violent, antisocial, and dangerous. He leaned forward on the counter and lowered his voice, and what he implied next about what might happen to a woman alone going up that mountain was so foul that Wren felt the blood rise in her face. She straightened her spine, she lifted her chin, and she replied with the quiet steel that had been forged in 7 years of Aunt Prudence's kitchen. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Mercer. I'll wait outside for my ride." She turned to leave. Dalton's hand shot out and grabbed her arm. His grip was hard, hard enough to bruise, hard enough to leave marks she would carry for days. His voice dropped to something private and threatening, something meant only for her. "Pretty thing like you doesn't need to waste herself on mountain trash. Stay in town. I'll find you proper accommodations." The implication was unmistakable. Wren pulled her arm free and walked out the door. She could hear Dalton and his friends all laughing behind her. She stood on the boardwalk, her heart hammering against her ribs, her arm throbbing where he had grabbed her, and told herself that she was not going to cry. She was not going to let this man and his ugly mouth and his rough hands make her cry. She had survived Aunt Prudence. She could survive this. But Dalton Mercer was not finished. He followed her outside. He was angry now. The rejection, quiet as it was, had wounded his pride, and men like Dalton Mercer do not forgive wounded pride. They avenge it in front of his friends and the handful of townspeople who had gathered on the boardwalks and in doorways drawn by the sound of voices and the scent of trouble. Dalton began to speak loudly. He called Wren things that made her ears burn. He said she was a painted woman sent for the Thorntons, using implications so crude that even Virgil Pope had the grace to look away for a moment. When Wren turned and told him clearly and firmly to leave her alone, Dalton Mercer struck her across the face. The blow was open-handed, but delivered with the full force of a man who had learned that violence against those smaller than himself carried no consequences. It snapped Wren's head sideways. She stumbled. Her carpet bag fell from her hands, spilling its meager contents across the boardwalk. Her mother's Bible landed in the dirt of the street. The daguerreotype of her parents skidded under the steps. Before she could recover, before she could even understand what was happening, Virgil Pope grabbed her arm from behind and Dalton hit her again, this time in the stomach. The air left her lungs in a sound she did not recognize as her own voice. What followed was deliberate. What followed was methodical. What followed was 3 men beating a woman in the middle of the street on a Tuesday afternoon in August, while the entire town of Elk Ridge watched. Sheriff Connors stood on the jail porch, arms folded, watching, not moving. Mrs. Henderson at the dress shop turned her face to the wall. Amos Baker at the livery pretended to be busy with the harnesses, his fingers fumbling with the buckles he had fastened 1,000 times before. Doc Whitfield's curtains moved. His face appeared behind the glass for a moment. Then the curtains fell back and the face disappeared and the door stayed shut. Wren tried to fight back. She scratched Dalton's face, drawing blood, her nails raking 3 lines down his cheek. The scratch only enraged him. He hit her again. A boot caught her ribs. She could not tell whose. Virgil or Lyle or Dalton. It did not matter. Pain was pain regardless of the boot that delivered it. She went down hard. Her palms scraped against the packed dirt of the street. Her face pressed into the earth. Red dust filled her nose and mouth. She could taste it, could feel it grinding between her teeth. Her dress tore. Blood bloomed from a cut on her lip, and the metallic taste of it mixed with the dust until she was choking on both. Another kick, this one to her back. Pain exploded along her spine like lightning running down a wire. And through it all, through the haze of agony and fear, and the taste of blood and dirt, Wren became aware of something almost worse than the beating itself. The silence. The awful, condemning, absolute silence of every person on that street. She could see them. Through swelling eyes and tears and the shimmer of pain, she could see their boots on the boardwalk, could see the hems of their skirts, could see them standing and watching and doing nothing because Dalton Mercer was the son of a prosperous man and Virgil and Lyle worked for a wealthy ranch, and Wren Ashford was nobody. Nobody at all. Sheriff Connors finally spoke, his voice carrying the bored tone of a man commenting on weather. "That's enough, boys. Point's been made." Dalton spat in the dirt inches from Wren's face. "Reckon she knows her place now." Then he walked away, laughing, his friends flanking him, their boots crunching on the boardwalk as they returned to the store like men returning from a morning's entertainment. The crowd dispersed. People went back to their business. The street emptied. Within moments, it was as if nothing had happened at all. Wren lay in the red Colorado dust and tried to move. Her right arm responded sluggishly. Her left didn't respond at all. Something was wrong. Something was broken inside her, not just bone, not just flesh, but something deeper, something more essential. It was hope. She realized it was hope that was finally cracking. She had held on to it for so long, through her parents' death, through 7 years of Aunt Prudence, through every slight and insult and cruel word in the hard gray city of Boston. She had told herself that if she just kept going, just held on, just endured one more day, things would get better. But things did not get better. Not for women like her. Not in places like this. Close your eyes, she thought. Close your eyes and let go. It'll be easier that way. The sun was making her dizzy, or maybe that was blood loss, or the concussion the doctor would later confirm. Her vision narrowed. Her consciousness began to slip away from the pain, from the humiliation, from the devastating knowledge that she had traveled 2,000 miles to die alone in the dirt of a town whose name she would never remember. Then she heard it, a sound so ordinary, so perfectly out of place that at first she thought she might be hallucinating. The steady, rhythmic clop of hooves on hard-packed earth. Not one horse, 3. The sound grew closer, stopped. She heard leather creaking saddles settling as their riders dismounted. 3 pairs of boots hitting the ground, moving toward her with purposeful strides. Quick, certain. The walk of men who knew exactly where they were going and what they intended to do when they got there. Good God. A man's voice, deep and rough, carrying an accent that suggested no particular region, but absolute authority. The words were breathed more than spoken, and in them, Wren heard 2 things simultaneously: shock and fury. Controlled fury. The kind that does not shout or bluster, but simply waits patient as a coiled spring for the right moment to release. Don't move her yet. Let me look first. A second voice, quieter, measured, analytical. A voice accustomed to observing before acting, to reading situations the way other men read weather. Who did this? A third voice, younger than the other 2, vibrating with rage that made no attempt at control. I'll kill them! I'll kill every last one of them! Wren forced her eyes open, squinted against the brutal afternoon light. 3 shapes moved into her field of vision. Broad-shouldered, tall, backlit by the sun so that for a moment all she could see were silhouettes. She thought her concussed brain was showing her triples, fracturing one image into 3. But no. As they crouched and their faces came into focus, she saw 3 distinct men who were unmistakably related. The same strong jaw, the same high cheekbones, the same extraordinary amber-colored eyes, like whiskey held up to firelight. But each face was different. Each carried its own history, its own particular arrangement of scars and lines and expression. 3 brothers, not twins, not triplets. Brothers separated by years but united by blood, and something else, something harder to name. A shared weight, a common wound. The largest of them knelt beside her first. He was the tallest by several inches, broad enough to block the sun entirely, with dark brown hair, cut short but perpetually unruly, and the faintest trace of premature gray at his temples. His face was hard, not cruel, just hard in the way that stone is hard, shaped by forces beyond its control into something that could withstand almost anything. His amber eyes were the darkest of the 3, and they carried an expression Wren would come to know well, the look of a man who has seen the worst the world has to offer and has built himself into a wall against it. His hands were enormous, calloused, scarred across the knuckles. But when they moved over her body, checking for breaks, assessing damage with practiced efficiency, they were impossibly gentle. He knew injuries. He had seen them before on battlefields and in frontier camps and in all the violent places where men like him had served and survived. This was Caleb Thornton, the eldest, the protector. Age 33, though the weight he carried made him look older. Behind him, the second brother was already scanning the street, his lighter amber gold eyes reading the scene with the systematic precision of a trained investigator. The scattered belongings, the faces behind curtained windows, the conspicuous absence of the sheriff from the porch where he had been standing moments before. This man was slightly leaner than his brother, with chestnut hair that fell longer across his forehead and an expression of quiet intelligence that never fully rested. He bent down and picked up Wren's Bible from the dirt. brushed the dust from its cover with careful fingers, held it as if he understood its value was not measured in money. This was Elijah Thornton, the Eli, the thinker, age 30, the one who had written the letters. The third brother stood with his fists clenched at his sides, trembling with the effort of not running into that general store and tearing it apart with his bare hands. He was the shortest of the three, though at 6'1" he would tower over most men, with sun-bleached brown hair and eyes the warmest shade of amber, like honey in summer light. His face was the most open, the most readable, and right now it was reading pure fury. Not the controlled kind his eldest brother wore. The raw kind, the dangerous kind. This was Sullivan Thornton. Boone everyone called him. The Heart, age 27. The one who had first said 3 months ago in the quiet of their mountain kitchen, "We need someone. This place is dying without someone to make it a home." "Miss Ashford," Caleb's voice was low. Careful, the voice of a man approaching a wounded animal, aware that fear can make even gentle things lash out. "Wren Ashford, can you hear me?" Wren managed a nod. Her vision was swimming. 3 faces hovered above her, and despite the pain, despite the blood in her mouth and the fire in her ribs, and the certain knowledge that her left shoulder was not where it was supposed to be, she felt a flicker of something so absurd she almost laughed. She had come 2,000 miles expecting one husband. She had gotten 3. "We're the Thorntons," Caleb said. "I'm Caleb. That's Eli and Boone. We were supposed to meet your stage. We got held up on the trail." A muscle jumped in his jaw. The controlled fury burned hotter behind his eyes, but his voice remained steady. "We're going to get you to the doctor, and then we're taking you home. Nobody is going to hurt you again. That's not a promise. That's a fact." Wren wanted to speak, wanted to ask which one was E. Thornton from the letters, wanted to understand what she had walked into, wanted to say she was fine, that she could manage, that they should just leave her alone before those men came back and started on them too. But her body had reached its limit. The pain was too vast. The relief of no longer being alone was too overwhelming. She could not make her voice work. "I'm going to pick you up, Queen," Caleb said. "It's going to hurt. I'm sorry for that." He slid one arm beneath her knees and another behind her shoulders, and he lifted her as if she weighed nothing at all. The pain of being moved was extraordinary. Wren could not stop the cry that escaped her lips, could not stop the tears that spilled from her swelling eyes. But through it all, through the fire in her ribs and the grinding wrongness in her shoulder, she was aware of the steadiness of his hold, the warmth of his chest against her side, the way he adjusted his grip to cause her the least possible discomfort, shifting her weight with a precision that spoke of practice of having carried wounded people before. The gentleness, that was what undid her. That a man this large, this obviously capable of violence, could handle her broken body with such extraordinary care. "Doc Whitfield," Caleb's voice cracked across the street like a rifle shot. The doctor's door opened immediately. The man had been watching, of course, had seen everything, and the shame on his face as he ushered them inside told its own damning story. While the doctor worked the scene outside, became something the town of Elk Ridge would remember for a very long time. 3 brothers stood on the boardwalk in a line, a wall of muscle and controlled fury, and the unmistakable promise of violence held in reserve. Caleb in the center, his hand resting on his gun belt, his eyes scanning the street with the systematic vigilance of a man trained to hunt and survive in hostile territory. Eli to his left, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching the faces in windows, with a slight knowing smile that was more unsettling than any open threat. Boone to his right, his feet planted wide, his fists still clenched, radiating protective fury like heat from a forge. Dalton Mercer made the mistake of stepping out of his store. Perhaps he thought his father's name would protect him. Perhaps he thought 3 strangers would not dare cause trouble in a town where the Mercer family held sway. Perhaps he simply did not understand what he was looking at. 3 men who had buried their parents and their 14-year-old sister in graves they dug with their own hands, and who had spent 5 years building themselves into something that would never be caught unprotected again. "Those mountain trash brothers bothering you, Sheriff?" Dalton called out, his voice carrying the forced bravado of a man who knows he is outmatched but cannot admit it. "That woman's a troublemaker. Was causing a scene in my store." Caleb turned, slowly, just turned, did nothing else. but the look in his amber eyes made Dalton take a step backward without intending to. "Say her name," Caleb said quietly. "The woman you beat. Say her name." Dalton could not. He did not know it, had not bothered to learn it. She was nobody to him, a thing to be used and discarded. "She's nobody, just some—" He did not finish. Boone moved, fast, explosive. One moment he was standing beside his brothers, and the next he had Dalton Mercer pinned against the wall of his own store, his forearm across the man's throat, his feet barely touching the ground. The transformation was so sudden, so violent, that the air seemed to crack around it. Virgil Pope and Lyle Dawson reached for their weapons, but Eli had already drawn his revolver, and the sound of the hammer being pulled back froze them where they stood. Eli did not raise his voice, did not need to. The click of that hammer said everything that needed saying. "She's ours," Boone said, his voice low and dangerous and vibrating with the effort of not closing his arm tighter. "She came here for us because we asked her to come, and you put your hands on her." His amber eyes burned. "Give me one reason not to break every bone in your body." "Boone," Caleb's voice was firm but unhurried. He let the moment stretch. Let Dalton feel the full weight of terror. Let the man understand in his bones what he had invited by raising his hand to a woman under Thornton protection. Then just when the moment seemed about to tip over into something irreversible, "Boone, not like this." Boone held Dalton for 3 more seconds. 3 seconds in which the only sound was Dalton Mercer's ragged breathing and the distant, indifferent call of a mountain jay. Then he opened his arm and stepped back. Dalton slid down the wall, gasping, his face the color of raw flour. "We're taking Miss Ashford home," Caleb announced. Not to Dalton, not to the sheriff, to the street, to every face hidden behind every curtain and every door. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority and the clarity of a church bell. "If anyone in this town touches her again, they will answer to all 3 of us. That is not a threat. It is the last warning you will ever receive." The silence that followed was different from the silence during the beating. That silence had been cowardice. This silence was fear, and everyone on that street understood the difference. The journey up the mountain took 3 hours. Eli rigged a travois behind his horse, a careful arrangement of blankets and wooden poles that would carry Wren more gently than any wagon over the rough mountain trail. The brothers moved with a coordination that required no words, each handling his task with the automatic efficiency of men who had worked together so long. They shared a kind of language beyond speech. Caleb carried Wren to the travois and settled her with infinite care. Boone scouted ahead on his horse, reading the trail for hazards. Eli managed the travois animal, adjusting the angle at every rough patch to minimize the jarring. Caleb rode rear guard, his rifle across his saddle, his eyes never once stopping their sweep of the tree line behind them. Through half-closed eyes drifting in and out of consciousness, Wren watched them. Watched the way Boone raised his hand to signal a turn in the trail ahead. The way Eli adjusted the travois without being told. The way Caleb's head moved in a constant, unhurried arc, scanning left to right and back again, the instinctive vigilance of a fawn who had learned the hard way what happened when you stop watching. The landscape changed as they climbed. The dry, dusty valley gave way to pine forests so dark and dense they seemed to hold their own weather. Streams crossed the trail, clear and fast and cold enough to make the horses step carefully. Wildflower meadows opened between the trees, blazing with color even in late August. The air grew cooler and cleaner, with every 100 feet of elevation tasting of pine sap and snow melt, and something ancient and untouched. Despite the pain, despite everything, Wren felt the beauty of it seep into her bones. This was nothing like Boston, nothing like anywhere she had been. It was wooled and vast and indifferent to human suffering, and there was a strange comfort in that indifference. The mountains did not care about Dalton Mercer or Aunt Prudence or the opinions of people who watched a woman get beaten and turned away. The mountains simply were, and there was something in their permanence, their unconcerned majesty, that made Wren's small human problems feel, if not smaller, at least survivable. The ranch appeared in the late afternoon light, sitting in a protected valley between 2 gentle rises of land. A large log cabin with a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. A solid barn with good timber walls and a roof that looked recently patched. Corrals with horses that raised their heads as they approached, ears pricked forward with curiosity. a series of outbuildings in various states of repair. It was beautiful, and it was a fortress. Wren noticed the details even through her pain. The cabin walls were thick. The windows had heavy shutters that could be barred from inside. The tree line had been pushed back far enough to create clear sight lines in every direction. The barn door was positioned so that someone standing on the porch could see anyone approaching from the east or the south. These men had built their home like a military position. And as Caleb carried her inside, she understood that whatever had happened to make them this way must have been terrible beyond imagining. The interior of the cabin was spacious and clean but spare. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall with a cast iron stove set into it for cooking. A long table of rough-hewn timber stood in the center, surrounded by 4 sturdy chairs. The kitchen area was well-equipped and efficiently organized. Everything was functional, everything was maintained, and nothing was warm. This was a space occupied by men who knew how to keep things in order, but had forgotten how to make them feel like home. The difference between maintained and loved is invisible to the eye, but unmistakable to the heart, and Wren felt it the moment she crossed the threshold. She noticed small things that told stories about each brother. Books stacked beside one chair, philosophy, poetry, a battered Shakespeare with a cracked spine. These were Eli's. A half-carved wooden horse sat on a workbench near the window. The grain of the wood caught mid-stroke, beautiful and delicate. This was Boone's work. And beside Caleb's place near the fire, there was nothing personal at all. Just emptiness. Just a chair and a hook for his hat and a vast, deliberate absence of anything that might reveal the man who sat there. They settled her in a bedroom that had clearly been prepared. Not hastily, with care. The bed had clean linens, a washstand held a basin and a small mirror. Hooks were mounted on the wall for hanging clothes. Curtains hung at the window, and someone had chosen fabric that complemented the golden mountain light that came through the glass. Someone had carved small hooks in the shape of pine cones into the wall. Someone else had chosen fabric for the curtains, and someone had installed a lock on the inside of the door. "So you feel safe," Caleb said gruffly when she noticed. "Your room, your space. Nobody enters without your say-so." It was the first time since her parents died that anyone had made a space specifically for her. A space that was hers, a space with a lock, a space where someone had carved pine cone hooks because they thought she might like them. Wren's eyes filled with tears. She tried to stop them. Could not. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb just nodded and left, closing the door quietly behind him. The lock was on her side. The choice was hers. Through the thin walls at night, Wren lay in bed with her ribs wrapped and her shoulder bandaged and her body a single continuous bruise, and she listened to the brothers talk in the main room. She could not make out every word, but she could hear the tones. The music of 3 voices she was learning to distinguish. Boone's anger, hot and urgent. "They beat her, Caleb. They beat a woman in the street. A woman who came here because of us. Because we asked her to come. That makes it our fault. That makes it our responsibility." Eli's measured calm costing him more than he showed. "Going back now accomplishes nothing except getting one or all of us arrested or shot. Mercer's father owns half that town. The sheriff is in their pocket. We need to think, not react." And then Caleb's voice, last and quietest, with the finality of a gavel falling. "She's under our roof now, under our protection. Whatever happened in that town does not follow her here. Nobody touches her again. Nobody." A pause. "And when she's healed, when she's strong, when she decides of her own free will whether she wants to stay or go, then we deal with Mercer. Not before. She comes first. Everything else comes second." Wren lay in the dark in this room these strangers had prepared for her, with a lock they had installed for her safety and curtains someone had chosen to catch the light, and felt something stir in the wreckage of her chest. Not love. Not yet. Something smaller and more fragile and infinitely more precious. The startled, tentative recognition that she might have found a place where her well-being actually mattered to someone. The next morning she woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and eggs. Her body screamed when she moved. Every breath was a knife, but she got up. She made her way to the main room. All 3 brothers were there, seated at the table, waiting for her. This was unusual, she would learn. Normally, at least one of them was already outside working before dawn. They had waited, What followed was the conversation that changed everything. Caleb sat at the head of the table, his expression closed and watchful. Eli was across from the chair they had left for her, his lighter eyes studying her with open curiosity and what might have been admiration. Boone had placed a plate of food in front of her seat, a generous portion of eggs and bacon and biscuits, and he sat beside her with his earlier fury channeled into something fierce and tender and protective. Eat first, Boone said, questions after. Wren ate. The food was simple but good, and she realized she could not remember the last proper meal she had consumed. Everything tasted like survival, like the first warm thing after a long cold night. Then Eli cleared his throat and began to explain. He was E. Thornton. He was the one who had written the letters. He was the one who had placed the advertisement. And he admitted with genuine regret in his quiet voice that the advertisement had been deliberately vague. I should have been honest from the start, Eli said. The truth is, Miss Ashford, this homestead belongs to all three of us. Our parents left it to us jointly. We work it together, live here together. We didn't advertise for a wife for one of us. He searched for words. We advertised for a partner, Caleb cut in, his voice flat and direct. Someone to share the homestead. Cook. Keep house. Help build something here. We weren't looking for... He stopped, his jaw tightened. What my brother is trying to say, Boone jumped in, his voice warm where Caleb's was cold, is that we're not expecting anything you don't want to give. We're not asking you to be a wife to all of us, or any of us if you don't want. We just... He looked at his brothers helplessly. We needed someone, Eli finished quietly. This place was dying without a woman's hand. Without someone to make it a home instead of just a place where three men sleep and eat and work and try not to think about what they've lost. Wren absorbed this. She had 1,000 questions, 1,000 fears. But looking at these three men, these enormous, scarred, battle-hardened men, who were stumbling over their words like boys at a church social, unable to articulate what amounted to loneliness and grief and the desperate human need to not be alone, she felt something unexpected bloom in her chest. Compassion. And beneath that recognition, the recognition of one broken thing seeing three others. I'll stay, Wren said. The relief in the room was palpable. Boone exhaled. Eli's slight smile deepened. Even Caleb's jaw unclenched just barely. But I have conditions. This surprised all three of them. Wren laid out her terms with the precision of someone who had learned that clarity is the only defense the powerless have. She would stay and work. She would be treated as an equal, not a servant. Her room was her room with the lock, with her autonomy, with her privacy. She would not be shared. If romantic feelings developed, she would make her own choices in her own time. And she wanted to understand why this homestead was fortified like a military position. Why three clearly capable men seemed to be living as though they expected an attack at any moment. Fair, Eli said immediately. More than fair, Boone added. Caleb just nodded, but Wren noticed something shift in his expression. Something ease, as if a verdict he had been dreading had come back in his favor. The days that followed took shape around rhythms as old as the mountains themselves. Wren healed slowly, her body demanding rest, while her mind demanded purpose. She could not simply lie in bed. She began with small things, organizing the kitchen, cataloging supplies, washing curtains, and hanging them in the mountain sun, rescuing the neglected kitchen garden from weeds, and planting herbs that would dry before the first frost. Each brother revealed himself through actions rather than words. Caleb was up before dawn and often gone before Wren woke. He handled the hard work, the dangerous work, checking fence lines, scouting the perimeter of the property, managing the larger livestock. He spoke little at meals and ate standing up out of habit, as if sitting down for food was a luxury he had denied himself so long he had forgotten how. But Wren noticed things. Fresh water in her wash basin every morning placed there before she woke. A warmer blanket appearing on her bed the night the temperature dropped. A small shelf installed in her room for her books. The wood sanded smooth, the brackets set with the precision of a man who built things to last. Caleb Thornton spoke through carpentry and provision, and his silence was louder than most men's shouting. Eli was the conversationalist, not talkative but willing to engage in actual dialogue. He and Wren discovered a shared love of poetry. His battered Walt Whitman became a bridge between them, borrowed and returned with pressed wildflowers marking favorite passages. He was the one who explained the ranch, who taught her about the mountain, which trails were safe, where the best water ran, how to read the clouds for weather. His intelligence was quiet and vast, and Wren found herself drawn to his mind the way a cold person is drawn to a fire. Boone was the warmest, the easiest to like. He brought her wildflowers without self-consciousness, bunches of columbine and Indian paintbrush left in a jar on the kitchen table, with no note and no acknowledgement. He taught her the names of the horses, told her stories about growing up on this mountain that made her laugh, real laughter, a sound she had not made in months, maybe years. When she was in pain and trying to hide it, he simply appeared with a cup of tea brewed without being asked, offered without expectation of thanks. But there was something else in this house, something darker than grief or loneliness, something that lived behind a locked door at the end of the hallway. Wren noticed it during her first week. The door was always closed, not just closed, locked. The brothers never referenced it. They moved past it as though it did not exist. But late at night, when the house was quiet and the only sounds were the creak of settling wood and the distant call of coyotes, Wren saw Caleb pause outside that door, his hand on the frame, his forehead pressed against the wood, standing there in the darkness like a man praying at a grave. She saw Boone glance at it with wet eyes. When he thought no one was watching, his easy smile gone replaced by something so raw it made her chest ache. She saw Eli deliberately look away from it every time he passed, his eyes finding something else to fix on anything else, as if the door itself could wound him. When Wren asked about it gently over breakfast one morning, all three brothers went still. The warmth drained from the room as if someone had opened a window to the winter. "That room stays closed," Caleb said, and his voice was granite, not cruel, just final. The voice of a man who has placed a boundary that cannot be moved. Wren did not push. She had learned in 7 years with Aunt Prudence when to press and when to wait. Behind that locked door lay something these three men could not bear to face and could not bear to forget. The key to understanding them, to understanding this fortress on the mountain, and the shadows behind their eyes lay in whatever that room contained. She would wait. She was good at waiting. 7 years of waiting had taught her that patience is not passive. It is simply strength that has learned when to be still. One night, 2 weeks after her arrival, Wren was awakened by sounds from Caleb's room. Not shouting, something worse. A low, agonized moaning, the sound of a man fighting demons that only visited in sleep. Thrashing, a crash as something fell from a nightstand. Then silence. Then footsteps as Caleb left his room and went outside, the cabin door opening and closing with the careful quiet of someone trying not to wake the others. Through her window, Wren could see him in the moonlight, standing at the edge of the porch, his hands gripping the railing until his knuckles went white, his head bowed, his massive shoulders shaking. He was crying. This enormous, terrifying, controlled man was crying alone in the mountain dark, and the sound of it, or rather the silence of it, because Caleb Thornton even wept without making noise, was the most heartbreaking thing Wren had ever witnessed. She did not go to him. Instinct told her he would not welcome it. Not yet. The walls he had built around himself were not the kind you could breach with sympathy. They were the kind that had to be dismantled from the inside stone by someone patient enough to wait for the builder to start removing them himself. So she lay awake listening until his footsteps passed her door again, until his door closed, until the house was silent once more. The next morning, Caleb was up before dawn as always. His face betrayed nothing. The shadows beneath his amber eyes were the only evidence of the night, and even those could have been explained by early rising and hard work. But when Wren placed his coffee in front of him and her hand brushed his, just for a moment, just the briefest contact of her small fingers against his scarred knuckles, he went very still. He looked at her hand, then at her face. Then he nodded, barely perceptible, and drank his coffee. It was not a conversation. It was not an acknowledgement in any language that could be written down. But something passed between them in that moment, a current of understanding that needed no words. And Wren knew with a certainty that surprised her that Caleb Thornton was not the stone wall he pretended to be. He was a man in agony, a man held together by discipline and duty, and the fierce, stubborn refusal to collapse under a weight she could not yet see, but could feel in every silence, every locked door, every night terror that sent him weeping to the moonlit porch. Something terrible had happened to these brothers, something that had burned them down to the foundations and left them to rebuild themselves from the ashes. And whatever that something was, It lived behind the door at the end of the hallway, and it came alive in Caleb's dreams, and it was the reason three strong men had sent a letter across 2,000 miles begging in the most dignified language they could manage for someone to help them remember what it meant to be human. That evening, Wren stood on the porch and watched the three brothers ride in from a day's work. Three silhouettes against the mountain sky, their horses picking their way down the trail in the amber light of sunset, moving in the easy synchronization of men who had shared labor and loss and silence for so long, they had become parts of a single organism. Caleb rode in front, scanning the tree line. Eli, behind his lighter eyes, taking in everything, cataloging, analyzing, filing away for future reference. Boone at the rear, his horse dancing slightly under him, his hand resting on the neck of the animal with the natural ease of a man who understood living things better than he understood people. Wren watched them approach, and she felt something rise in her chest that was bigger than gratitude and deeper than relief and more terrifying than anything Dalton Mercer's fists had done to her. She was beginning to feel like she belonged, not to these men, not as property or obligation or transaction, but here, in this valley, in this cabin that needed curtains and a garden and someone to sit at the table and make meals into occasions instead of fuel. Here on this mountain that did not care about her past or her poverty or the opinions of people who watched women get beaten and turned away. She belonged here. And for an orphan who had never belonged anywhere, who had moved through the world like a letter without an address, that feeling was the most dangerous thing she had ever encountered. Because belonging meant caring, and caring meant the possibility of loss. And loss was something Wren Ashford understood the way she understood breathing. She had lost her parents. She had lost her home. She had lost 7 years to a woman who saw her as nothing more than unpaid labor. She knew what it cost to care about things that could be taken away. But standing on that porch watching three broken men ride home to a house that was slowly, carefully becoming something more than a fortress, Wren made a choice. She would stay. She would care. She would risk the loss. Because the alternative, the life of never caring, never belonging, never risking her heart on anything or anyone, was not really living at all. It was just surviving, and Wren Ashford was tired of surviving. She wanted to live. The sun dropped behind the peaks. The shadows lengthened across the valley. The three brothers reached the barn, dismounted, and began the evening routine of tending their horses and storing their gear. And Wren went inside to start dinner, setting 4 places at the table because 4 was the right number. 4 was what this house had been waiting for. 3 weeks. 21 days of waking without dread. Of coffee brewed before dawn by hands that were not her own. Of sunlight through curtains that smelled of mountain air instead of Aunt Prudence's coal smoke and bitterness. Of 4 chairs at a table where 4 people sat and ate and talked about small things, fences and weather, and the particular stubbornness of a horse that refused to be shod, and in the talking, made those small things feel like the most important things in the world. 21 days of healing. Wren's bruises faded through their spectrum, purple to green, to yellow, to the pale ghost of memory. Her ribs stopped screaming with every breath and settled into a dull ache that was bearable and then barely noticeable. Her shoulder, which Doc Whitfield had reset with an apology and a shot of whiskey, regained its range of motion, one painful degree at a time. The cuts closed. The swelling went down. Her face in the small mirror above the washstand began to look like her face again. But the healing that mattered most was not happening in her body. It was happening in the house. Wren had transformed the cabin, not through grand gestures, through the accumulation of small, persistent acts of care that are the real architecture of a home. Curtains washed and rehung so they caught the morning light. The kitchen garden rescued from a season of neglect. The soil turned and amended tomato plants staked and tied beans climbing strings she had strung between posts Boone had driven into the ground without being asked. Herbs drying in bundles from the ceiling rafters, filling the cabin with the scent of rosemary and sage and thyme. A vase of wildflowers on the table replaced every 3 days because Boone kept bringing fresh ones, leaving them in a jar on the porch railing with no note and no acknowledgement, as if wildflowers simply appeared by natural law in places where he happened to walk. The kitchen was where the transformation showed most clearly. Wren had discovered that simple ingredients handled with attention could become something that nourished more than bodies. The first time she made biscuits from scratch, light and golden, and served with butter and the wild honey Eli had traded for at a neighboring ranch, All three brothers had stared at their plates as if she had performed an act of sorcery. Our mother used to make biscuits like these, Boone said softly, and the table went quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that is not empty but full of memory and loss and the fragile recognition that something new can taste like something beloved and gone. Caleb ate three. He did not comment, but he sat down to eat them, and Wren understood, without needing to be told, that sitting at this table still cost him something. That every meal taken in this room was a small act of defiance against a grief that wanted him standing at the counter with his back to the chairs eating alone, refusing to occupy a space that memory had made unbearable. He was sitting now. That was enough. Each brother had changed in the 3 weeks since Wren's arrival, and each had changed in his own way, at his own pace, following the private map of his own particular wounds. Boone had blossomed. There was no other word for it. Having someone to direct his warmth towards someone who received his kindness without suspicion or mockery had unlocked something in him that must have been waiting a long time for the right key. He found excuses to work closer to the house, volunteered for tasks that brought him inside during the day. He taught Wren to ride carefully, mindful of her healing ribs, walking beside Rosie the bay mare with one hand on the bridle and the other ready to catch Wren if she started to slip. One afternoon he took her up to the high meadows above the ranch to see the wild horses. They sat on a ridge together, the grass warm beneath them, the sky enormous above, and watched a herd of mustangs graze in the golden light while Boone talked about his dream. Breeding mountain-hardy horses, crossing the endurance of wild stock with the temperament of domestic animals, creating something new from the meeting of two things that had never met before. His eyes lit up when he talked about it. His whole body changed, the tension leaving his shoulders, his hands moving through the air to sketch shapes only he could see. Wren watched him and thought, this is who he is when nothing hurts. This is the man underneath the grief. You light up when you talk about horses, she observed. Boone turned to look at her, his warm, honey-amber eyes holding hers with an openness that was almost startling. I light up when I talk about things I love, he said. There was nothing subtle about it. Boone did not do subtle, and Wren's heart turned toward his warmth the way a flower turns toward the sun, instinctively, gratefully, without quite meaning to. Eli's change was quieter, more internal. The conversations between him and Wren had become a nightly ritual conducted in low voices by the fire after Caleb had retreated to his room and Boone had gone to check the horses one final time. They talked about books and ideas and the nature of things, philosophy and poetry, and the question of what makes a life meaningful. One rainy afternoon, trapped indoors by a storm that turned the world to gray, Eli read aloud to her from his battered Whitman. Not the famous poems, the obscure ones, the ones about ordinary people finding extraordinary meaning in the quiet business of living. His voice was low and rich, and the words moved through the dim room like something you could touch. You wrote those letters to me as if you already knew me, Wren said quietly when he finished. Eli set the book down. His expression was unguarded in a way it rarely was. The analytical armor lowered the watcher, allowing himself to be watched. I wrote to the woman I hoped existed, he said. The woman who would read between the lines and understand what I couldn't say directly. That 3 men on a mountain were lonely and broken and needed someone to show them how to be human again. He paused. When I read your replies, I knew I'd found her. Found her or created her. Those letters shaped my expectations, Eli. They made me brave enough to come. Then we created each other, Eli said, and the truth of it settled between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Caleb's change was the hardest to see. He remained the most guarded, the most walled off, the most committed to the fiction that he needed no one and nothing beyond the work of his hands and the scope of his vigilance. But the walls were cracking. He no longer ate standing up. He sat at the table for every meal now, always at the head, slightly apart, maintaining the illusion of distance, even as the distance itself was shrinking. He still spoke little, but Wren had learned to read his silences the way she read his brother's words. And what she read, there was a man paying attention. Paying very close attention. The moment that defined Caleb came on an ordinary afternoon. Wren was hanging laundry in the side yard when she found him sitting on the chopping block, his head in his hands, utterly still. Not asleep, not resting. frozen in a posture of such absolute grief that the air around him seemed to darken. She approached carefully. A man like Caleb, startled from pain, could react in ways he would regret. "Bad day?" she asked gently. He looked up. His amber eyes were red-rimmed, raw. "Elle's birthday," he said, and his voice sounded like a road that had been traveled too hard for too long. "She would have been 19 today." Wren sat beside him on the chopping block. She did not offer platitudes, did not say it would get better or that time heals or any of the well-meaning lies people tell the grieving because they cannot bear the weight of someone else's sorrow. She just sat, her shoulder touching his massive arm, sharing the weight simply by being present. They stayed like that for nearly an hour. Neither spoke again. The shadows moved across the yard. A hawk circled overhead. The horses called to each other in the corral, and two people who understood loneliness sat together in it, and by sitting together made it something else. When Caleb finally stood, he paused, and so briefly she almost missed it. He brushed his rough fingers across the back of her hand. "Thank you," he said, "for not trying to fix it." "Some things can't be fixed," Wren replied. "They can only be carried, and carrying is easier when you're not alone." He looked at her then, really looked, and in that look she saw the first crack in the deepest wall. Not a door, not yet, just a hairline fracture. But it was enough. It was a beginning. It was on the morning of the 22nd day, with all three brothers gone from the ranch for the first time since her arrival, that Wren found the truth. She was in the barn looking for a broom she had seen leaning against the back wall. The barn smelled of hay and leather and horse, the warm animal scent that Boone carried on his clothes and his skin. She moved through the dim interior, past saddles hung on racks and coils of rope and the ordered tools of ranch work, and found instead of a broom a wooden trunk pushed deep into a dark corner, half covered by old horse blankets. She should not have opened it. She knew that even as her hands reached for the iron clasp, this was not her property. This was not her business. Whatever the Thornton brothers had hidden away in this trunk, they had hidden it for a reason. But Wren Ashford had traveled 2,000 miles on the strength of a letter from a stranger, and she had not done that by being cautious. She opened the trunk. Inside, she found the remnants of a different life. A child's primer with Nell Thornton written in careful practiced letters on the flyleaf. The handwriting of a girl learning to shape her name, pressing too hard with the pencil, smudging the L, because left-handed children always smudge the L. A woman's apron, white cotton, scorched along one edge. The scorch mark was dark brown, almost black, and the fabric around it was stiff and brittle, damaged by heat so intense it had changed the nature of the cloth. A photograph, a family portrait in the stiff, formal style of the era. A man and a woman stood behind their children, both of them strong-jawed and clear-eyed. The man, with the broad shoulders and steady gaze she recognized in Caleb. The woman with a gentleness in her expression that she saw echoed in Boone. Behind them, four children, three boys, the eldest, nearly grown, the middle one, a lean and watchful adolescent, the youngest still carrying the softness of childhood in his face. And beside them a girl, small, maybe 4 or 5 in the photograph, dark-haired, clutching a cloth doll against her chest with both hands, the way children hold the things they love most tightly, as if the world might try to take them away. And at the bottom of the trunk, the doll itself. Wren lifted it out with hands that had begun to tremble. The doll was partially burned. Its cloth body was blackened on one side, the fabric charred and crumbling. One button eye was missing. The cotton hair, which had once been stitched in careful loops of brown yarn, was melted on the left side into a hard, dark mass. Someone had pulled this doll from a fire, or from the ashes after a fire. Someone had kept it for years, unable to throw it away, unable to look at it, hiding it in a trunk in the darkest corner of a barn where no one would see it, and no one would ask about it, and no one would make them explain what it meant. Wren held the burned doll in her lap and understood. Everything, all at once, the locked door, the night terrors, the fortress walls and the clear sight lines, and the way Caleb scanned the tree line as if expecting attack at any moment. The grief that saturated this house like smoke saturates wood, so deeply embedded, it had become part of the structure itself. Not one death, deaths, a family, parents and a sister, fire. She was sitting on the barn floor, the doll in her lap, tears streaming down her face. When Boone found her, he stopped in the doorway. The afternoon light was behind him, turning him into a silhouette, and for a moment he did not move. did not speak, did not breathe. Then he saw what she was holding, and the sound he made was not a word. It was the sound of a wound reopening, the sound of scar tissue tearing along fault lines that had never fully healed. Nell, Boone whispered. She was 14. She still held that doll every night and when she slept, same as when she was little. She never outgrew it. She said it helped her feel safe. He sat down beside Wren on the barn floor, his long legs folding awkwardly, his big body suddenly seeming too large for the space, too large for the emotion it was trying to contain. And he told her, their parents, Josiah Thornton, who had been a rancher and a circuit preacher, a man who could deliver a sermon that made sinners weep and then go home and shoe a horse with equal conviction. Ruth Thornton, who sang hymns that echoed off the mountains, whose voice was so pure that neighbors would ride for miles on Sunday mornings just to stand outside the cabin and listen. And Nell, their baby sister, sweet and shy and stubborn, in the quiet way that bookish children are stubborn. She wanted to be a school teacher when she grew up. She followed her brothers around like a duckling, always 3 steps behind, always watching, always learning. She was the gentlest person Boone had ever known. They were murdered 5 years ago. Eli arrived back into the ranch an hour later, saw Boone and Wren on the porch, saw the burned doll, and sat down heavily in the chair nearest the door. His face went blank in a way Wren was learning to recognize. Not emotionless, the opposite. So full of emotion that the only way to contain it was to show nothing at all. He filled in the facts with the analytical precision that was his armor against feeling. A man named Silas Crane, an outlaw who had built a criminal empire across 3 territories through intelligence and ruthlessness and the strategic elimination of anyone who opposed him. Not a brute, a businessman, the worst kind. Caleb, serving as an Army scout, had inadvertently discovered one of Crane's supply routes during a military operation, had reported it, had disrupted a network that was making Crane millions. Crane did not forget. Crane did not forgive. He sent men to the Thornton Ranch while the brothers were away. They burned the house, Eli said, his voice as flat and controlled as a surveyor's line, with our parents and Nell inside. Left a message carved into the barn door. He paused. The mountains aren't big enough to hide. The brothers had been scattered that day. Caleb on a scouting mission 60 miles east. Eli and Boone in town buying winter supplies. By the time they saw the smoke column rising above the ridge, by the time they rode their horses nearly to death, getting back there was nothing left. Nothing but ashes, and bodies, and a burned doll clutched in the hands of a 14-year-old girl who had tried to hide under the kitchen table her father built. Caleb told the final layer that evening. He did not choose to tell it. He returned from the north pasture at dusk, walked into the cabin, and stopped. Wren had placed the burned doll on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. She had set it there gently, carefully, giving Nell's memory a place of honor instead of banishment in a dark trunk. She had cleaned the soot from its remaining button eye and smoothed the unburned side of its hair. It sat on the mantel between 2 of Boone's carved wooden horses, looking out at the room with its single eye. And it was the most heartbreaking thing in the house. Caleb stood in front of the fireplace for a long time, his back to Wren, his hands braced on the mantel on either side of the doll, his weight forward on his arms, his head bowed. When he spoke, his voice was one she had never heard from him. Not controlled, not flat, not the granite wall he showed the world. This voice was broken. I found them. Eli and Boone were behind me, but I was faster. I went in first. I found what was left of them. The pause that followed was so long that Wren thought he was finished, that the weight of it had finally stopped his voice completely. But he continued. Nell was in the corner of the kitchen. She tried to hide under the table our father built with his own hands. His voice cracked like a beam giving way. She was still holding that doll. He turned. His amber eyes were wet and blazing, and the pain in them was so vast it seemed to fill the room from wall to wall, pressing against the log, pushing at the windows. I rebuilt this house, every log, every nail, built it on the same foundation because I couldn't let Crane win completely. But I couldn't make it feel like home again. Every room, every corner. All I can see is what I lost, what I failed to protect. Wren stood. She crossed the room to where he stood. She did not touch him. She had learned that Caleb's boundaries were load-bearing walls, and removing them without warning could bring the whole structure down. But she stood close enough that he could feel her presence, close enough that her warmth reached him through the cold of his grief. "You didn't fail them?" she said, and her voice carried the quiet ferocity of absolute conviction. "Silas Crane killed them. His men killed them. You were doing your duty. There is no shame in that. I should have been here. If you had been here, you would have died with them. That's all that would have changed, and Nell's doll would still be in that trunk with no one to set it on the mantel where it belongs." The silence that followed was enormous, a silence big enough to hold 5 years of grief and guilt and the first fragile possibility that carrying all of it alone might not be the only option. Then Caleb looked at the doll and at Wren, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not healing, not yet, but the first acknowledgement that healing might someday be possible. That night, Caleb unlocked the door at the end of the hallway. He did not invite Wren in. He did not say a word. He simply turned the key, he pushed the door open and walked away to the porch where he stood in the moonlight, breathing, letting the mountain air fill the space that the locked room had occupied in his chest. Wren walked past the open door and looked inside. A girl's room, untouched. A small bed with a faded patchwork quilt. Books stacked on a nightstand. A window with curtains. Ruth Thornton must have sewn the fabric chosen with a mother's instinct for what her daughter would love. A pair of shoes beside the bed, small waiting for feet that would never fill them again. Everything preserved exactly as Nell had left it. The room was no longer locked. The ghosts were no longer hidden. And the house for the first time began to breathe. The peace lasted exactly 1 more week. Wren was in the kitchen garden pulling weeds from around the tomato plants she had coaxed back to life. The autumn was making itself known in the cooling evenings and the subtle shift in the quality of light. She had pushed her sleeves past her elbows and tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and she was humming. This detail mattered more than she knew. She had not hummed since before her parents died. Not in Aunt Prudence's house, not on the stagecoach, not during the long, painful weeks of healing. But here in this garden with dirt under her fingernails and the sun on her back and the mountains standing guard all around her, Wren Ashford was humming a hymn her mother used to sing. She was becoming herself again. The sound of approaching hoofbeats cut through her contentment like a blade through cloth. 3 riders appeared on the ridge above the ranch, not the Thornton brothers. These riders moved differently, spread out, deliberate, tactical. The formation of men who expected trouble and wanted to be ready for it. The hair on the back of Wren's neck rose. "Caleb," she called, and her hand went to the small derringer he had given her 2 weeks ago. He had been teaching her to shoot. She had been a good student, but her hands had never trembled like this during practice. The 3 brothers emerged from different locations with a coordination that would have been impressive if it were not so clearly practiced. Caleb from the barn, Eli from the workshop, Boone from the horse corral. They converged on Wren and positioned themselves around her in a triangle of flesh and steel. Caleb between her and the riders, Eli flanking right, Boone flanking left. Wren stood in the center of that triangle, her derringer in her hand, and understood for the first time that whatever was coming, these 3 men intended to die before they let it reach her. The lead rider was older than the other 2, perhaps 50, with a scar running from his left eye down to his jaw, livid and permanent, a souvenir of violence that had reshaped his face into something that could not be forgotten. He sat his horse with the absolute confidence of a man who had survived everything the world had thrown at him and expected to survive whatever came next. His voice when he spoke was surprisingly cultured, almost pleasant. "Caleb Thornton, it's been a long time." "Not long enough, Dutch," Caleb replied. His voice had gone to the register Wren had learned to fear. Not louder, quieter, the absolute zero of human emotion, the temperature at which fury becomes something still and dense, incapable of anything. "State your business and leave." The man called Dutch smiled, and it was the most unflinching expression Wren had ever seen on a human face. A smile that contained no warmth, no humor, no connection to anything resembling joy. A predator's smile. The smile of a man delivering a message he knew would cause pain. "Can't do that, I'm afraid. We got business with you. Crane sends his regards." The name hit the air like a gunshot. Wren felt all 3 brothers react. Caleb went stone still, his hand moving to his gun with the slow deliberation of a man fighting the urge to draw and fire. Boone's jaw clenched so hard, Wren could hear his teeth. Eli's eyes narrowed, but his mind was already working, already processing, already looking for the information hidden in the threat. Silas Crane can go to hell, Caleb said, and his voice shook, not with fear, with rage held on a leash so short it was cutting into his hands. Now, Caleb, let's be reasonable. Reasonable. The laugh that came from Caleb's throat was unlike any sound Wren had heard from him. Harsh, ugly, the sound of something breaking under pressure. He murdered my family, burned them alive. And you want me to be reasonable? Dutch shrugged, one shoulder casual. The shrug of a man discussing a minor inconvenience. That was business. Nothing personal. You were getting too close. Crane had to send a message. Wren saw Caleb take a step forward and saw the two younger riders tense their hands, moving to their weapons. She saw the muscles in Caleb's back go rigid. She saw his hand close around the butt of his revolver. Crane wants to talk, Dutch continued, his voice never losing its pleasant tone. He's got a new proposition. Willing to let bygones be bygones if you cooperate with a new venture. I wouldn't help Silas Crane find water in a rainstorm, not even if he promised to leave you alone. Let you live out your days in peace on this little ranch. Dutch's eyes slid toward the house, toward Wren, and the cold calculation in that glance made her blood freeze. You've got yourself a woman now, I hear. Pretty little thing from back east. Sure would be a shame if something happened to her. The change in Caleb was instantaneous. His gun was in his hand before Wren saw him draw it. The barrel was pointed at Dutch's chest. His eyes were death itself. Touch her, Caleb said, and his voice was the quietest it had ever been. And I will kill all three of you before your bodies hit the ground. That is not a threat. That is a promise. Dutch raised his hand slowly, but the smile never left his face. Easy now. Nobody's threatening anybody. Just saying. Crane remembers what happened last time. Remembers how you lost everything because you wouldn't stop chasing him. Seems to me you'd want to avoid a repeat. Get off my land, right now, and tell Crane that if he or any of his men come within 10 miles of this place, I will finish what I started 5 years ago. Big words, Dutch said, from a man who couldn't protect his own family. Wren did not see Caleb move. One instant he was standing with his gun raised. The next he had Dutch dragged from his saddle, his revolver pressed against the man's temple, his free hand fisted in Dutch's shirt. Say that again, Caleb whispered. I dare you. The two younger riders had their guns drawn, pointed at Caleb. Nobody was moving. Nobody was breathing. Wren's own derringer was up and aimed, though she was not certain she could hit anything at this distance. But she would try. If those men shot Caleb, she would try. Point made, Dutch said, his composure cracking for the first time. Let me up and we'll go. Caleb held him for one more heartbeat. 2. Wren could see the war behind his eyes, the desire to pull the trigger, the need for this man's blood to pay for the blood already spilled. Then he released Dutch and stepped back. His gun stayed trained on the man's chest. Dutch mounted his horse. His two companions kept their weapons drawn until they were clear. Then they turned and rode east, on dust rising in their wake. It was Eli who spoke first after the riders had crested the ridge and disappeared. Dalton Mercer, he said, and his voice was the coldest Wren had ever heard it. Every trace of warmth and humor stripped away, leaving only the razor edge of intelligence applied to a problem that demanded solving. What about him? Boone asked, his fists still clenched, his body still vibrating. Dutch knew about Wren, knew her name, knew she came from Boston, knew she arrived by stagecoach 3 weeks ago. Eli turned to face his brothers, and his amber gold eyes held the terrible clarity of a man who has just assembled a puzzle from pieces everyone else had missed. That's information only someone in Elk Ridge would know, someone who watched her arrive, someone who has reason to communicate with Silas Crane. The silence that followed was the silence of a detonation. The moment before the blast wave arrives, the moment when you understand what is about to happen but cannot yet feel its force. Mercer is Crane's informant, Eli continued. That's why his family has been trying to push us off this land. It was never about timber rights. It was about serving Crane's interests. The Mercers are his eyes and ears in Elk Ridge. Boone turned to Wren, and the look on his face was devastation layered on fury, layered on something deeper. The man who beat you, the man who hit you in the street, while, while the whole town watched. His voice broke. He's working for the man who killed our parents, who killed Nell. The connection was a web of poison. The local bully and the outlaw king were not separate evils. They were the same evil, the same system. Dalton Mercer's fists and Silas Crane's fire were connected by money and malice and the casual cruelty of men who viewed other human beings as obstacles to be removed. Then we deal with both, Caleb said, and his calm was the most frightening thing of all. They spent the next 5 days preparing. Caleb handled the tactical work with the methodical intensity of the soldier he had been. He fortified the cabin, heavy furniture positioned as barricades behind windows, extra ammunition stored in every room, buckets of water placed strategically against fire, and the irony of that precaution was lost on no one. He walked the property perimeter daily, identifying sight lines and dead zones, marking defensive positions with notches on trees that only his eyes could read. One evening, Wren found him drawing a map of the ranch on a piece of tanned hide. His hand was steady, his lines precise, every contour of the land rendered from memory with the accuracy of a man who had memorized his world down to the individual stone. She watched him mark positions, where a sniper could hide, where horses could be concealed, where the escape routes ran. "You've been expecting this," she said, "since the day I rebuilt the house." He looked up from the map, and his amber eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I just didn't expect to have something worth fighting for when they came." Eli handled intelligence. He rode to neighboring ranches, the Colbys 10 miles east and the Petersons 15 miles north, gathering fragments that his analytical mind assembled into a picture. Unfamiliar riders on the old mining road, a stranger asking questions about Thornton Land and Red Bluff, a supply cache discovered near the creek crossing that had not been there a month ago. Crane's men had been scouting them for weeks. Boone handled the practical preparation that would save their lives. He saddled 4 horses every night and left them ready in the barn. He hid a cache of supplies in a cave 2 miles up the mountain: food, water, blankets, ammunition, medical supplies. Everything they would need if they had to run. He carved small wooden pegs and drove them into the trail at intervals so that even in total darkness, they could find the hidden path by touch alone. And Boone did one more thing that no one asked for and everyone needed. He maintained normalcy. He insisted they eat dinner together. He brought Wren flowers. He told jokes that fell flat and didn't care because the attempt at humor in the face of danger was itself a declaration of faith. One evening, he taught Wren a card game their mother Ruth used to play, and for 20 minutes, the 4 of them sat around the table, laughing and arguing about rules, and it was the most human any of them had felt in weeks. Wren handled her own preparation with the determination that had carried her 2,000 miles from Boston. She demanded advanced shooting lessons. Caleb taught her the rifle, now not gently anymore, but with the hard, fast urgency of a man who knew combat was coming and wanted her ready. He positioned her at windows, timed her reloads, tested her under pressure by shouting while she aimed. She practiced until her shoulders ached and her ears rang, and she could hit a man-sized target at 70 yards 3 times running. She also prepared medical supplies, tore cloth for bandages, studied the small medical manual Doc Whitfield had left with her, made poultices and splints, because she had learned enough of violence now to know that someone would bleed before this was over. The night before the attack came, they sat on the porch as the sun set behind the peaks, the mountains ablaze with color, the world heartbreakingly beautiful in the way that things are most beautiful when you understand they might be about to end. 4 people, 4 chairs, the evening air cooling around them, carrying the first hint of autumn and the scent of the pines and the distant sound of the creek running over stones. Boone gave Wren a small, carved horse. He had been working on it for weeks, shaping it in the evenings by firelight, sanding the grain smooth with a patience that seemed impossible for a man his size. It was a miniature of Rosie, the bay mare Wren had bonded with. Every line was perfect, every proportion exact. A work of art made by calloused hands that understood beauty because they understood love. "So you'll always have a piece of this place," he said, his voice rough. "Whatever happens." They held hands and watched the stars appear, and the simplicity of the moment, two people finding comfort in each other's presence against the approaching dark, was a kind of prayer. Eli found Wren reading by lamplight later that evening and sat beside her. He recited Emily Dickinson from memory. Then he told her something he had never told another living soul. He had written the advertisement because of a dream, a real dream. A woman with honey-colored hair, standing on this porch in the morning light, and when he woke, he knew with a certainty that defied his rational mind that they needed to find her. "I don't know if I believe in fate," he said, "but I believe you were supposed to come here." Caleb found her last, after the others had gone to bed. He stood beside her on the porch, not touching, staring out at the darkness with those amber eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. "If things go bad," he said, "tomorrow or the day after or whenever they come, I need you to promise me something." "What?" "Live, whatever happens to us, to me, to my brothers, you survive. You get on that horse and you ride, and you don't stop, and you don't look back." Wren turned to face him. In the moonlight, his eyes were luminous, and the pain in them was so vast she could barely breathe. "I won't make that promise," she said softly. "I promised I'd stay. I promised I'd be part of this family. And I keep my promises, Caleb Thornton." Something broke in his expression, not the walls, something behind the walls, something he had been guarding even more carefully than grief. "You're the bravest person I've ever known," he said, and then barely audible, "I can't lose someone else." Wren placed her hand on his forearm. He did not pull away. "You won't," she said. "We face this together. All of us. That's how this family works." He nodded, and in the silence that followed, the last wall fell. Not with a crash, with a whisper, with the quiet sound of a man choosing it after 5 years of choosing isolation to let someone in. The attack came on the fifth night, after midnight. The moon hung fat and yellow in the Colorado sky, casting the mountain landscape in silver and shadow. The first shot shattered the kitchen window. Glass sprayed across the room where hours before 4 people had eaten dinner and laughed at Boone's story about the colt that refused to be saddled. Wren rolled off her mattress and hit the floor with the rifle in her hands before her conscious mind caught up. Caleb's training had written itself into her muscles, into her nerves, into the automatic responses that operate below thought. "They're here," Caleb bellowed, and his voice shook the walls. "Positions." "Ahoim." The brothers moved with terrifying precision. Caleb took the front, the most exposed position, the position most likely to draw fire. He took it without discussion because he was Caleb Thornton, and standing between his family and danger was not a choice but a physical law. Eli took the east side where the terrain offered attackers the most cover and where his analytical mind could read the pattern of the assault and call adjustments. His voice cut through the chaos with remarkable clarity. "2 on the east behind the woodshed, 1 moving toward the barn, 3 behind the water trough." Boone took the west. His shots were less precise than Caleb's, but delivered with an intensity that kept his sector clear. He fought the way he did everything else, with his whole heart. Wren covered the back, the direction they had deemed least likely for assault, but which Caleb had insisted they prepare for anyway. In a fight, he had told her, the attack always comes from where you're not looking. At least 8 men, perhaps 10, well-armed and coordinated. This was not a random assault by bandits. This was a military operation planned and executed by professionals. Wren fired her first shot at a man advancing through the moonlight toward the back wall. She missed, adjusted, remembered Caleb's voice. "Breathe, sight, squeeze, don't pull." She fired again. The man fell, her first deliberate act of violence against another human being. She felt nothing except the immediate need to find her next target. There would be time for feeling later, if there was a later. Caleb's rifle cracked in measured intervals. Each shot deliberate, precise. The patience of a marksman who understood that one well-aimed bullet was worth 10 fired in haste. Through the chaos, Wren heard his firing rhythm. Crack, pause, crack, pause. Each pause was him acquiring a new target. Each crack was a decision. The attackers advanced in waves, disciplined, coordinated. But the Thornton brothers had something no hired gun could match. They were defending their home, their family, and they fought with a fury that mercenary loyalty could never replicate. Then came the fire. The smell hit first. Acrid, chemical, lamp oil. Someone had doused the walls. Then the orange glow began racing up the timber like a living thing consuming the wood with a hunger that was almost sentient. Heat built inside the cabin. Smoke poured through the gaps between logs. For Caleb, this was the nightmare made flesh. The same fire, the same smell, the same orange light, his face drained of color. His hands froze on his rifle. For 3 agonizing seconds, he was not here. He was 5 years in the past, standing in front of another burning house, hearing screams that existed only in memory. Caleb. Wren was beside him, her hand on his face, forcing him to look at her, forcing him into the present, into this moment, into the eyes of a woman who was not a ghost and not a memory, but real and alive, and refusing to let him disappear into his pain. "Not this time," she said. "You hear me? Not this time. We're getting out, all of us." He came back. The soldier returned, the eyes focused. "Front door," he commanded. "Together. Boone horses, Eli cover fire. Wren with me." They burst through the door together. Boone sprinted for the barn where 4 horses stood saddled and ready, his preparations, saving all their lives. Eli laid down suppressive fire from the porch, his rifle cracking in measured bursts. Caleb shielded Wren with his body as they crossed the open ground, and she felt a bullet tug at her skirt, missing flesh by inches. Boone emerged from the barn leading 4 horses. They mounted in queue. Caleb pulled Wren up behind him when there was no time for her to mount her own horse, his arm like an iron bar across her waist. They rode. Behind them, the cabin burned. Everything. The curtains Wren had washed. The table where they had shared meals. The mantel where Nell's burned doll sat between 2 of Boone's carved horses. The books Eli treasured. The garden Wren had planted. 5 years of rebuilding and 1 month of new beginning, all of it turning to ash and ember and smoke, rising into the mountain sky. Eli took a bullet graze across his shoulder during the flight. Boone's horse stumbled on the trail, but recovered. They fought a running battle through the darkness, using terrain the brothers knew by heart. Narrow passes and creek crossings, and switchbacks that confused pursuit. After a mile of desperate riding, the attackers fell behind. They pushed higher into the mountains until they reached the natural fortress of boulders Caleb had identified weeks before. They dismounted. Eli was bleeding. Boone was shaking with adrenaline. Caleb was white-lipped with controlled rage and the residual terror of a man who had just watched fire consume his home for the second time. Wren was physically unhurt, but her hands would not stop trembling. Behind them, visible against the dark mountain sky, the ranch burned, the glow pulsing like a heartbeat, like a wound that would not close. "We can't stay here," Wren said, pressing strips torn from her underskirt against Eli's shoulder, wound her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "We go to Red Bluff. We find the marshal. We do this the right way. With the law. With help." Caleb's jaw was set. His eyes burned with something beyond anger. Something that wanted blood. Something that wanted Silas Crane dead at his feet. "The law failed us before," he said. "Then we make it work this time. But we do it together, not with you riding off alone to die in a canyon." The argument hung in the cold mountain air. Revenge or justice? Blood or law? Wren looked at each of them. Boone, who had built a fire small enough to hide, whose hands were still gentle, even now as he checked the horses. Eli, pale from blood loss, but already thinking, already planning his mind, reaching ahead to the moves that would be required. Caleb, standing guard with his rifle against his shoulders, scanning the darkness with those amber eyes, the man who had carried the weight of his family's death for 5 years and was now carrying the weight of their survival. "You'll stand with us," Caleb had said on that first day in Elk Ridge, standing over a broken woman in the dust, speaking words he had meant as a statement of protection. Now huddled in the rocks with the glow of their burning home behind them and the unknown ahead, Wren understood that the promise went both ways. She would stand with them, all 3 of them, through whatever came next, because what remained when the house was gone and the walls were down and there was nothing left but 4 people, and the mountain dark was not property or shelter or the illusion of safety. What remained was them, and that was enough to build on. Dawn came slowly to the mountains, the way truth comes slowly to men who have spent years hiding from it. The first gray light found 4 people on a rocky shelf halfway up a peak that had no name huddled against stone, that was older than memory, older than grief, older than the particular human pain that had driven them to its shelter. Below them, invisible now in the pre-dawn dark, the trail they had ridden in desperate flight wound down toward a valley where their home was still burning. The smoke was visible, even from this height, a dark column rising against the lightning sky, and Wren watched Caleb watch it with the expression of a man witnessing a funeral he had already attended once before. Eli's shoulder wound had stopped bleeding during the night, but his face was the color of candle wax and his breathing was shallow. Boone had built a fire so small it was barely more than a handful of embers, just enough to warm water for cleaning the wound, and he sat beside his brother with one hand on Eli's good shoulder, steadying him with touch the way he steadied nervous horses. They were alive. They were together. And they had almost nothing else. "We move at first light," Caleb said. His voice was hoarse from the smoke and the shouting and the long silent hours of standing guard while his family slept. "There's a route through the high country, game trails and creek beds. No maps. Crane's men won't know it." "How far to Red Bluff?" Wren asked. 2 days if we push. Eli can't push." "I can push," Eli said, and even now, pale and wounded and sitting on cold stone at dawn, there was iron in his voice. "You can barely sit upright," Boone said gently. "I can sit a horse. That's enough." They rode at first light, into the high country, into terrain so wild and remote that the trails were little more than suggestions, faint tracks left by deer and elk that wound through stands of ancient pine-crossed meadows of late wildflower, followed ridgelines where the wind cut like a blade and the world fell away on both sides into distances that made the eye ache. Wren walked when the trail was too narrow for horses. Her traveling dress, the navy blue dress she had worn from Boston, was torn now in a dozen places, stained with smoke and blood and the red earth of a country that had tested her in ways she could never have imagined. Her hands were scraped raw from climbing rocks. Her boots, never designed for mountain trails, were coming apart at the soles. She did not complain. Not once, not a single word of protest or self-pity or the reasonable observation that she was a 23-year-old orphan from Boston who had no business climbing mountains in a torn dress with a derringer in her waistband and 3 wounded men depending on her to keep walking. She just walked. And it was during the walking, during the longing hours of putting one foot in front of the other on trails that climbed toward the sky, that the conversations happened that changed everything. Caleb and Wren walked together on a narrow section of trail where the horses had to be led single file. He was ahead of her, and she studied his back as they climbed, the tension that never left his shoulders, the way his head moved in that constant unconscious sweep, scanning for threats, even here, even now, even in countries so remote that the nearest human being is probably a day's ride in any direction. "Tell me about the army," Wren said, partly because she wanted to know, and partly because the silence between them had grown heavy with things unsaid. He told her, not bragging, not dramatizing, just the facts laid out with the economy of a man who did not waste words on decoration. He had served as a scout in the Colorado and Wyoming territories, tracked hostiles, survived ambushes, led patrols through country that killed careless men. He was good at keeping people alive. "Except the people who mattered most," he added, and the bitterness in his voice was so old it had calcified into something that sounded almost like calm. "You're keeping us alive right now," Wren replied. "That matters." Caleb stopped walking, turned. The morning light was behind him and his face was in shadow, but she could see his eyes, those amber eyes that had watched his family burn and had spent 5 years refusing to close against the image. "I love you," he said. The words were blunt, undecorated, stripped of poetry or charm, or the careful constructions that other men might use to soften the impact. They were simply true, the way a mountain is true, the way gravity is true, the way the fact of stone is true. "I fought it," he continued. "God knows I fought it. Told myself I was just protecting you, just doing my duty, just keeping a promise to a woman who came to our door needing help." His voice roughened. "But I love you, Wren Ashford. I have loved you since the moment I picked you up out of that dust and felt you breathe against my chest and knew that if anything happened to you, I would burn this entire territory to the ground." The mountain was silent around them. The horses stood patient on the trail, Somewhere far below, a creek moved over stones, and the sound of it was the sound of the world continuing its ancient business, regardless of the small human dramas played out on its surface. "And your brothers?" Wren asked, because the question had to be asked, because pretending it did not exist would be a dishonesty none of them could afford. "They love you too, in their own ways. I'm not blind. And that doesn't bother you?" Caleb considered this with the seriousness it deserved. He was not a man who answered questions about his heart lightly, and Wren respected him for taking the time to tell her the truth rather than the easy thing. It should probably, in any normal life it would. But we're not normal people living normal lives. We're three men and a woman on a mountain trying to build something out of ashes. He paused. "If loving you is what keeps all of us together, then I'll learn to share what I feel. Because I'd rather have you and my life shared than lose everything again." It was the most words Caleb Thornton had ever spoken at one time, and each one landed like a nail driven by a sure hand into strong wood. Wren did not answer immediately. She could not. The weight of what he had said, the cost of saying it, the courage it required from a man who had spent 5 years building walls against exactly this kind of vulnerability, all of it pressed against her chest until she could barely breathe. "I love you too," she said finally. "I don't know what shape that love will take. I don't know how this works or if it can work, but I know what I feel and I won't pretend I don't." Caleb nodded, and they walked on. Later that day, Eli and Wren rode together on a stretch of trail wide enough for two horses abreast. He was pale, his injured arm held carefully against his body, but his mind was as sharp as ever, working through angles and implications with the relentless efficiency that defined him. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about the advertisement, about how you came to be here." Wren waited. "I wrote the letters. I placed the ad. That's true. But the decision to send for a bride wasn't mine." He looked at her, and his amber gold eyes held something between confession and wonder. It was Caleb's. Wren's surprise must have shown on her face because Eli smiled. A real smile, not the slight analytical curve he usually offered, but something warm and tired and honest. "I know, he seemed the most resistant to having you here. He seemed like the last man on earth who would send for a stranger to come live in his house." Eli shifted in his saddle, wincing as the movement pulled at his wound. "But Caleb doesn't do anything he doesn't want to do. He told me to place the ad. Told me to find someone who could, and these were his exact words, make that house into something worth protecting again. He didn't want to admit he needed someone. Needed you. So he made me do the asking. That's Caleb. He'll carry the weight of the world on his shoulders, but he cannot ask for help." The revelation rearranged everything Wren thought she understood about the man who had lifted her from the dust. Every action she had witnessed, the room he prepared the lock. He installed the shelf, he built the blanket that appeared on cold nights. All of it was not merely the duty of a protector. It was the language of a man who loved but could not speak the word, who asked for help by pretending someone else was asking, who wanted so desperately to be saved that he disguised the rescue as a practical arrangement. "He wrote the letter," Wren said softly. "Your hand, but his heart." "Yes," Eli said, "my hand, his heart. And Boone's idea. It took all three of us to find you." I think that's the point, isn't it? None of us is complete alone. That evening at a rest stop on a high ridge where the setting sun turned the entire western sky to fire, Boone sat beside Wren and took her hand. No preamble, no hesitation. Just his big calloused hand closing around her smaller one, with the natural ease of a man who understood that some things did not require permission or explanation. "I know you can't choose all three of us," he said. His warm amber eyes were gentle but clear. No self-pity, no manipulation, just honesty offered without expectation of return. "That's not how the world works, even out here. And I know that when you choose, it might not be me. That's all right." He squeezed her hand. "Whatever you decide, you're my family. You're our family. Nothing changes that." It was the most mature thing anyone had said in the entire course of this story, and it came from the youngest brother. The one people might have expected to be the most impulsive, the most possessive, the most likely to let his heart override his judgment. But Boone Thornton understood something his older brothers were still learning. That love is not a competition, that the strongest kind of devotion is the kind that holds on loosely, That saying, "I want you to be happy even if your happiness doesn't look the way I imagined," is the bravest sentence a human heart can construct. They reached Red Bluff on the second day. The town was larger than Elk Ridge, a proper settlement with a courthouse, a church, a doctor's office, and a federal marshal's office flying an American flag that snapped in the mountain wind. They arrived looking like refugees, which they were. Wren's dress was in ruins. Eli could barely stay upright. Caleb and Boone were grim-faced and armed and covered in trail dust and dried blood. The townspeople stared as they rode up the main street, four people on exhausted horses carrying the particular gravity of those who have survived something that should have killed them. Dr. Sarah Cole, one of the few female physicians on the frontier, took one look at Eli and had him on her examination table within minutes. She was a practical woman with wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that were small but certain, and she addressed the Thornton brothers with the brisk competence of someone who had long since stopped being intimidated by large men with large problems. While Dr. Cole worked on Eli, Wren walked into the office of Federal Marshal Everett Hargrove and told him everything. She started from the beginning, from Boston, from the letter, from the stagecoach, and Dalton Mercer's fists and the taste of blood and dirt in the street of Elk Ridge, while good people watched. She told him about the Thornton Ranch, about the locked door and the burned doll and the murdered family, about Dutch and the three riders and the message from Silas Crane, about the attack, the fire, the desperate flight through mountain darkness. And she told him what she wanted. Not protection, not shelter, not the small mercy of being left alone. Justice. "Dalton Mercer in Elk Ridge," she said, and her voice was as steady as a surveyor's line drawn across rough country. "He's Crane's informant. He's the one who told Crane about us. And 5 years ago, he or his father may have been the ones who told Crane where the Thornton family lived. I need him arrested. I need him to face a court for what he helped do." Marshal Hargrove was a lean man in his 50s with the kind of face that had been weathered into something beyond handsome or plain. Just capable. Just experienced. He listened without interruption, his sharp eyes taking in everything, and when Wren finished, he was quiet for a long time. "Silas Crane," Hargrove said, "been looking for that son of a gun for years. Rangers want him, federal warrants outstanding in 3 territories. He's like smoke. Minute you think you've got him, he slips through." "Then help us catch him," Wren said. "He sent men to kill us. They failed. He'll try again. Next time we might not survive. What makes you think I can do what the Rangers couldn't? Because you're here and they're not. Because Caleb Thornton spent years hunting Crane and knows how he thinks. Knows his patterns and his hiding places and the way his mind works." Wren leaned forward, holding the marshal's gaze with an intensity that made the seasoned lawmen blink. "And because if you don't help us, Caleb is going to go after Crane alone, the moment he's healed enough to ride. And he'll either get himself killed or he'll kill Crane outside the law. Either way, justice won't be served." Hargrove studied her for a long moment. "You love him," he said. "Caleb Thornton." It was not a question. "Yes," Renan answered. "And I won't watch him throw his life away on revenge when there's a better way." She found Caleb outside the marshal's office, standing in the street with his arms crossed, staring west toward the mountains, toward the smoke that was no longer visible, but that he could still see, would always see written on the inside of his eyelids like a brand. She knew what he was thinking. She had learned to read him the way Eli read books and Boone read horses. He was calculating distance to Crane's camp, number of men he could take down before they got him, whether his death would be worth it if Crane died too. "Don't," she said. "Don't what? Don't do what you're planning. Don't ride off alone to die in a canyon with your rage satisfied and your family destroyed." She stepped in front of him, forcing him to look at her instead of at the horizon. "You have 2 brothers who would follow you without hesitation. If you ride, they ride. You wouldn't just be killing yourself. You'd be killing Boone and Eli too." Caleb flinched. She had found the low-bearing wall, not his own life, which he had stopped valuing 5 years ago, on the day he found his family in the ashes, but his brothers, Boone and Eli, the only people he had allowed himself to love until a woman with cornflower blue eyes and a torn navy dress walked into his life and rearranged everything. "Nell wouldn't want this," Wren continued, pressing the advantage. "Your mother wouldn't want this. Your father, who preached forgiveness from a circuit pulpit, would not want his son to become a murderer. They would want you to live, to build, to have children who carry their names. You don't know what it's like. His voice was raw. The anger, the need to look into his eyes when he dies and know that he knows who ended him and why. You're right. I don't know exactly what that's like, but I know what it's like to be beaten and left for nothing. I know what it's like to want to hurt the people who hurt you. Wren's voice carried the fierceness that had sustained her across 2,000 miles. But living, really living, not just surviving. That's the victory. That's how we win. Not by becoming like Crane, but by refusing to let him destroy us. She took his hand, his massive scarred hand that had built houses and fired rifles, and held her with such impossible gentleness. Come back to me, Caleb. Come back to your brothers. Justice can be served without you dying for it. The war played out across his face. She watched it the way you watch a storm approach across open country, knowing it must pass but uncertain of the damage it will leave behind. The desire for blood, the hunger for personal vengeance, fighting against the newer, more fragile Devan for the life he had begun to build with her. She saw the exact moment the balance tipped. Not because the rage disappeared, it would never disappear entirely, but because he chose consciously and deliberately to value the living over the dead. All right, he said roughly, your way, together. Together, they stood in the dusty street of Red Bluff while the sun set behind the mountains, and something inside Caleb Thornton that had been wound tight as a spring for 5 years finally slowly began to uncoil. Over the following 2 weeks, while Eli healed under Dr. Cole's care and the brothers regained their strength, a plan took shape with the methodical precision that defined everything the Thorntons did when they worked as one. Marshall Hargrove wired the Texas Rangers. 2 experienced men rode in within the week. He assembled a posse of 12, not townspeople playing soldier. Frontiersmen, former soldiers, men who knew how to ride hard and shoot straight and follow orders when the bullets started flying. Caleb provided intelligence that no one else possessed: Crane's patterns, his known camps, his defensive positions, the way he thought under pressure. Years of military scouting and months of obsessive study had given Caleb a map of the outlaw's mind, and he laid it out for the marshal with the precision of a general planning a campaign. Eli supplemented with analytical insight, escape routes based on terrain, supply dependencies that could be exploited, weaknesses in Crane's organization that Dutch's visit had inadvertently revealed. Boone prepared the horses and equipment with the thoroughness that was his gift. Selecting mounts, checking tack, packing supplies for a multi-day operation in rough mountain country. And Wren did something none of them expected. She insisted on coming. The argument was brief and spectacular. All 3 brothers opposed her. The marshal raised an eyebrow. Dr. Cole counseled against it. Wren was immovable. I can shoot. I can ride. I've already killed men defending this family. I am not staying behind while my people ride into danger. Your people, Boone asked, and despite everything, a small smile broke through his worry. My people, Wren confirmed, looking at each brother in turn. My family. The only family I have. So yes, I'm coming. Deal with it. Caleb set conditions. She would stay close, follow orders. If things went wrong, she would ride for safety. Wren agreed to the first 2 conditions. She lied about the third. The posse rode out at dawn. 12 men, 1 woman, and 3 brothers who had been waiting 5 years for this day. They followed the trail of Crane's retreating men into a box canyon 40 miles northwest of Red Bluff, a natural fortress with steep walls and one entrance that was both its greatest strength and its fatal weakness. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Half the force would approach the canyon mouth, make noise, draw attention. The other half, Caleb, Eli, Boone, Wren, and 2 rangers, would circle above and take the high ground on the canyon rim. The climb to the rim was treacherous, a goat path in places with loose stone and sheer drops that made Wren's heart hammer against her healing ribs. Eli's shoulder slowed him, and Boone stayed close, one hand ready to catch his brother if he stumbled. Caleb led with his rifle slung across his back, his movements fluid despite the terrain. The soldier fully returned, now the rancher put away. Wren climbed with gritted teeth and bleeding hands, refusing help until she physically could not reach the next handhold. at which point Caleb simply lifted her without comment, as naturally as lifting a saddle onto a horse, and set her on the ledge above. From the rim they could see the camp. 17 men, rough shelters against the canyon walls, a cooking fire, horses picketed in a line, and there standing near the largest shelter with the unmistakable bearing of a man accustomed to being obeyed was Silas Crane. He did not look like a monster. That was the thing that struck Wren most forcibly. He looked like someone's grandfather, gray-haired, lean, ordinary, a man you might pass on the street without a second glance. A man who could sit across from you at a dinner table and discuss weather or philosophy or the price of cattle, and you would never know, could never guess, that he had ordered the murder of a woman and her 2 children and a 14-year-old girl who clutched a cloth doll because it made her feel safe. Evil rarely looks the part. That is what makes it dangerous. The marshal's signal came. 3 shots in rapid succession echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Below, chaos erupted. Crane's men scrambled for weapons. Horses reared. The air filled with shouting and dust and the flat crack of gunfire. The team on the rim opened fire. The battle was fierce but decisive. The advantage of elevation was overwhelming, and the posse at the canyon mouth pushed forward with the determination of men who had ridden too far to turn back. Crane's fighters were caught between 2 forces pinned in their own fortress. Some surrendered, others fought until they could not fight anymore. Through the smoke and noise, Caleb fired with the lethal precision of a man who had spent his adult life learning exactly where to place a bullet. Eli called positions despite his wound, his analytical mind turning the chaos into patterns, finding order in the disorder. Boone fought with the fierce energy that characterized everything he did, his shots not as precise as Caleb's, but delivered with a conviction that kept his sector clear. Wren held a position on the rim, her rifle steady, and dropped 2 men who tried to flank the posse's ground force. She fired without hesitation, not because she had become someone who took life easily, but because the lives she was protecting were worth more to her than the lives of men who had come to this canyon to serve a murderer. Then she saw Caleb C. Crane. The outlaw was running, moving toward his horse with the desperate speed of a man who understood that his fortress had become a trap. He was 20 yards from escape when Caleb went off the rim. Wren shouted his name, but he was already gone. Down the canyon wall with reckless speed, rock crumbling under his boots, his rifle in one hand, his body moving with the fluid, controlled violence of a man who had spent years hunting and being hunted, and who understood in his bones the geometry of pursuit. He hit the canyon floor running, intercepted Crane 10 yards from the horse. Crane went for his gun. Caleb was faster. His shot hit the outlaw's shoulder, spinning him, dropping him to the red dirt. Caleb was on him in seconds. The rifle barrel pressed against Crane's temple, his breathing ragged, his amber eyes wild with something beyond anger, beyond grief, something that had been building for 5 years, compressing itself into this single moment, this single point of pressure, where a finger meets a trigger and the distance between justice and murder is measured in ounces. "Say their names," Caleb whispered. "Josiah, Ruth, Nell, say their names." Crane looked it up at the man standing over him, and even in pain, even with blood soaking through his shirt and a rifle barrel against his skull, his composure held. That was the terrifying thing about Silas Crane. His calm was not an act. It was the genuine product of a mind that had long ago stopped recognizing other human beings as real. "I don't know their names," Crane said. "They were casualties of a business dispute, nothing personal." Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. Wren could see from the canyon wall where she was already climbing down, tearing her dress on the rocks, her hands leaving blood on the stone. She could see the whitening of his knuckle, the tremor running through his arm, the moment stretching like a wire pulled to its breaking point. 5 years, 5 years of grief and guilt and night terrors and the sound of screams that lived only in memory. 5 years of rebuilding a house he could not make feel like home, of eating standing up, because the table reminded him of the table his father built, of locking a dead girl's room, because he could not bear to look at her empty shoes. 5 years compressed into the pressure of a finger on steel. Wren reached the canyon floor. She did not run. Running would have startled him, and a startled man with a gun is the most dangerous thing in the world. She walked, deliberately, her torn dress trailing behind her, her bleeding hands at her sides. walking toward the most dangerous moment of all their lives with the same quiet determination that had carried her off a stagecoach in Elk Ridge and across 2,000 miles of frontier and into the hearts of three men who had forgotten how to love. She stood beside Caleb, not between him and Crane, beside him, and she placed her hand gently over his on the rifle. "Don't give him that power," she said. Her voice was soft but absolute. The voice of a woman who knew that the next few seconds would determine not just whether Silas Crane lived or died, but whether Caleb Thornton would survive the killing. "Don't let him make you into what he is. He murdered them. I know. He burned them alive. I know. And he will pay for it. He will stand trial. He will be convicted. He will hang. But not like this. Not murdered in the dirt the way he murdered them." Wren's hand pressed down on his, and she felt the tremor in his muscles, the terrible vibration of a man at war with himself. "Nell wouldn't want this. Your mother, who sang hymns that echoed off these mountains, wouldn't want this." She paused, and then she said the only thing that could reach him. "I don't want this. I need you whole, Caleb. I need you here, please. Come back to me." The seconds stretched. The canyon was silent. Even the wind had stopped, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. Then slowly Caleb lowered the rifle. His body sagged against hers and Wren held him. This woman who weighed barely 100 pounds, holding up a man who was a foot taller and twice her weight, holding him with arms that should not have been strong enough, but were because the strength required was not physical. It was the strength of a heart that refuses to let go. Caleb wept, not the silent tears of the moonlit porch. Great, shuddering, racking sobs that shook his entire frame. The grief of 5 years releasing all at once, a dam breaking a flood finding its way downhill after being held too long. He wept into her shoulder while Marshal Hargrove stepped in and pulled Silas Crane to his feet and bound his hands and spoke the words that the law requires. Boone reached them first, dropped to his knees beside his eldest brother, his hand on Caleb's shoulder, his amber eyes bright with tears. Eli arrived a moment later, stood guard with his rifle raised and his wounded arm pressed against his body, making sure no one interfered, protecting his family the way he always had, quietly, completely. 4 people in a canyon, the smoke still clearing. The last echoes of gunfire fading into the mountain walls, standing together the way they had stood from the beginning, the way they would stand until the end. In the aftermath, as the wounded were tended and the dead were counted and the living were bound in irons, Leland Dutch Rawlings asked to speak with the marshal. Dutch was a practical man. Self-preservation was his strongest instinct, stronger than loyalty, stronger than pride, stronger than whatever bond he had once held with Silas Crane. He saw the way the wind was blowing, and he adjusted his sails accordingly. What he revealed connected every thread. Harold Mercer Dalton's father had been Crane's business partner for over a decade. The general store in Elk Ridge was a front for laundering Crane's money. The timber operations the Mercers claimed to support were covers for moving stolen goods and weapons through the territory. And 5 years ago, it was Harold Mercer who provided the location of the original Thornton homestead to Crane's men in exchange for a promise that the Thornton land would eventually be acquired for Mercer interests once the family was gone. Dalton's beating of Wren was not random cruelty. It was an attempt to drive away the Thornton bride to keep the brothers isolated and vulnerable. When it failed, when Wren stayed and the cabin became something that resembled a home, the Mercers alerted Crane, and Crane sent his men to burn it down. The beating in the street, the fire that killed a family, the fire that consumed a tomb, all connected, all part of the same system. The same evil wearing different masks in different towns, but serving the same purpose, the enrichment of men who viewed other human lives as obstacles to be removed. The trial took place 6 weeks later in Austin. It was a sensation. Silas Crane, the outlaw king who had evaded justice for a decade, finally in chains. Harold and Dalton Mercer arrested and transported south, seated in the defendant's box, with the dazed expressions of men who had always believed their money and their connections would protect them from consequence. Wren and the Thornton brothers attended every day. They sat in the front row, Wren in the center, Caleb on her right, his hand covering hers on the bench, his thumb tracing small, unconscious circles on her knuckle. Eli on her left, his injured arm in a sling, his sharp eyes watching every witness, with the attention of a man building a case in his own mind. Boone beside Eli, his jaw tight, his eyes wet when the prosecution described Nell's death, his knuckles white against the bench. The testimony unfolded over 3 days. On the first day, witnesses described the scope of Crane's empire, the robberies, the murders, the protection rackets, the systematic terrorization of communities across 3 territories. On the second day, Caleb took the stand. He spoke in a voice that was flat and controlled, and somehow, because of that control, more devastating than any dramatic display of emotion could have been. He described his parents, his sister, the doll she carried, the table his father built. He described returning to the homestead and finding what remained of his family. He did not embellish. He did not dramatize. He simply told the truth, and the truth was terrible enough. The tears that ran silently down his face while his voice remained steady broke the courtroom. The jury foreman wiped his eyes. 2 women in the gallery wept openly. Even the judge, a frontier jurist who had seen more than his share of human ugliness, paused to compose himself. On the third day, Wren testified. She stood before the court in a simple dress that Dr. Cole's wife Margaret had helped her make, and she was no longer the battered girl in torn navy blue who had arrived in Elk Ridge on a stagecoach with $12 in a letter. She was a woman who had been through fire literally and figuratively, and who had emerged not unscathed but unbroken. "I came to this territory with nothing but hope in a letter," she said. "I was beaten in the street by Dalton Mercer and his companions because I refused his advances. The sheriff watched and did nothing. The townspeople watched and did nothing. I was left in the dirt to die." Her voice carried to every corner of the courtroom. 3 men I had never met rode into that town and lifted me up. They took me home. They gave me safety and purpose and, her voice caught, family. These men tried to destroy that family the same way they destroyed Josiah and Ruth Thornton and their daughter Nell. They tried to burn us out. They tried to kill us, but we are still here. We are standing, and they are the ones in chains. The courtroom erupted in applause. The judge did not silence it. The jury deliberated for 47 minutes, guilty on all counts. Silas Crane was sentenced to hang. Harold Mercer received 20 years. Dalton Mercer received 15, the judge noting that his particular cruelty toward a defenseless woman and his role in facilitating the murder of a child warranted additional condemnation. Virgil Pope and Lyle Dawson, arrested separately in Elk Ridge, received 10 years each. They attended the execution, all 4 of them, because they needed to see it finished. When Crane dropped through the trapdoor and the physician confirmed what the rope had accomplished, Caleb drew a long, shuddering breath and turned to his brothers. "It's finished," he said. "They're at peace now. Father, Mother, Nell, they're at peace." Boone put his arms around Caleb. Eli put his arms around both of them. 3 brothers held each other in the prison yard while Wren stood beside them, her hand on Caleb's back, feeling 5 years of grief and rage and guilt flow through them and out of them like a river that has finally found the sea. They went home, not to the burned ranch. Home was not a building anymore. Home was a piece of land in a mountain valley with a creek running through it and old oaks standing guard over meadows that blazed with wildflower. Home was a foundation that had been laid but never built upon. Home was potential. Home was the future they were about to construct with their own hands. The new house went up fast. Marshal Hargrove sent men to help. The Colbys rode over from 10 miles east with a wagon of timber. The Petersons brought tools and labor. Even a few people from Elk Ridge came tentative and ashamed, carrying offerings of food and materials and the unspoken apology of people who know they failed and cannot undo it. Wren accepted their help. She did not pretend to forget. "I forgive you," she told Mrs. Henderson, who had turned away from the dress shop window on the day of the beating. "But I won't forget, and I hope the next time you see someone who needs help, you'll remember what cowardice costs." The house was designed through a series of arguments that were the happiest conflicts any of them had ever known. Caleb wanted thick walls, multiple exits, clear sightlines. Eli wanted a library alcove with shelves and a reading nook by the east window. Boone wanted a kitchen large enough for a family that might grow with a table that could seat more people than currently occupied the house. Wren wanted a porch that wrapped around 3 sides: south for morning coffee, west for watching sunsets, north for looking at the high meadows where the wild horses ran. They built all of it, every board, every stone, Every nail driven by hands that were building not just a structure, but a declaration that the men who had tried to destroy them had failed. That fire could burn a house, but it could not burn what the house contained. On a crisp afternoon in November, with the first frost silvering the meadow grass, and the new house standing solid and warm behind them, Caleb Thornton stood on the porch he had built and turned to Wren. "Wren Ashford," he said, and his rough voice carried the weight of everything they had survived and the lightness of everything they were about to begin. "I know this isn't how things are usually done. I know I come with more baggage than a freighted wagon and two brothers who are going to be underfoot for the rest of our lives. But I love you, we love you, and we are asking, will you stay? Not as a hired hand, not as a guest, as family, as ours." Eli stepped forward, holding a simple gold band. "I found this in our mother's things. She would want you to have it. She would want to know her sons found someone worth loving." Boone stood slightly behind his eyes, bright his smile the warmest thing on the mountain. What they said. Except I'd have said it with fewer words and more flowers. Wren looked at these three men, these three broken, beautiful, fierce men who had pulled her from the dust and carried her to the mountain and fought beside her and bled for her and trusted her to see their wounds and hold their grief and bring their dead sister's doll out of the darkness and set it where it belonged. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'm yours. Yes, this is home." The wedding took place a week later in the mountain meadow below the house. Marshall Hargrove gave Wren away. Dr. Cole stood as witness. The ceremony was simple. Wren married Caleb because the law requires one name on the certificate. But the vows were spoken to all three brothers, and all three placed their hands on hers as the preacher pronounced them family. The door closed softly on their wedding night, and when morning came, everything had changed between them. The arrangement that had begun as a practical necessity had become something sacred, something built on shared suffering and mutual rescue, and the quiet, daily, unglamorous work of learning to love people who have been damaged by the world and are worth loving anyway. 30 years passed. They passed the way years do when they are full, not quickly, not slowly, but completely. Each one lived all the way through each season, bringing its own work and weather in the particular beauty that belongs to that time and no other. The ranch thrived. Wren and Caleb had two children, a daughter they named Nell Ruth for the sister who never grew up, and the mother who sang hymns in the mountains. A son they named Josiah Elijah for the father who preached and built, and the uncle who found his mother through the poetry of carefully written letters. Boone never married, but he became the most devoted uncle in the history of the American frontier. His horse breeding operation grew renowned across 3 territories. The mountain hardy stock he had dreamed of on that ridge, with Wren becoming a reality that exceeded even his generous imagination. He built a cabin a quarter-mile from the main house, close enough to be family, far enough to be his own man. He ate dinner at the big table every night. Nell Ruth called him Uncle Sonny because he was the one who always made her laugh. Eli served as the county's teacher judge in intellectual conscience. He built a schoolhouse on the ranch property where mountain children came 3 days a week to learn reading and writing and the art of asking questions that matter. He began writing a book, a history of the mountain communities, and in the evenings he and Wren still traded lines of poetry across the dinner table, while Caleb pretended to be annoyed and Boone pretended to understand. On the evening of their 30th anniversary, Wren and Caleb stood on the porch. He had built the porch that wrapped around 3 sides of a house designed by argument and constructed by love. The sun was setting. The mountains were on fire with color. And in the yard below, grandchildren, Nell Ruth's 3 little ones, chased each other through the wildflowers, their laughter echoing off the peaks. Caleb's hair had gone completely silver, but his shoulders were still broad, and his back was still straight, and his amber eyes still held the particular intensity that had first looked into hers from above a cloud of red Colorado dust. Wren had silver threaded through her honey blonde hair and lines around her eyes that had been earned by laughter as much as by hardship, and hands that were no longer the soft hands of a Boston orphan, but the capable hands of a woman who had built a life from nothing and would not trade a single callus. Boone was slower now, but his smile was unchanged. Eli wore wire-rimmed spectacles and still read every evening the Shakespeare replaced by his own manuscript, but the hunger for understanding as fierce as ever. "Do you ever think about Elk Ridge?" Caleb asked. "About that day, every day." Ren replied honestly, but not the way I used to, not with fear or anger. I think about it the way you think about a door you walk through, a terrible door, but one that led somewhere worth going. I think about my parents, Caleb said softly. About Nell. I think they'd like you. I think they'd like who you became. All three of you. I think your mother would look at this porch and these children and this life and weep with joy. And Nell would adore her namesake, would follow her around the way you said she followed you, like a duckling with a big heart. Caleb's arm tightened around her waist. In the yard, Boone was chasing the smallest grandchild with exaggerated roaring, while the child shrieked with delight. Eli sat on the porch steps with Josiah, Elijah's oldest boy, reading aloud from the Whitman that had survived 2 house fires and 30 years of love, the binding held together now, with twine and faith. Thank you, Caleb said. For what? For standing. When the whole world was trying to knock you down, you stood. And when I couldn't stand, you held me up. When all three of us were lost in the dark, you were the light that brought us home. Ren leaned into him, watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and pink and amber. The color of his eyes, she thought, the color of home. We held each other up, she corrected. That's what family does. From inside the house, Nell Ruth called that dinner was ready. Her voice bright and certain, the voice of a woman who had never known hunger or fear or the particular cruelty of being told she was worthless. The voice of a woman raised by people who understood because they had learned it the hard way that every child deserves to feel safe. Wren closed her eyes. Let the mountain air fill her lungs, pine and wildflower and wood smoke and the first cool breath of autumn. She thought about a stagecoach climbing into mountains she had never seen, about a letter that smelled of pine resin and hope, about a girl who had $12 in a one-way ticket and the stubborn, foolish, magnificent belief that somewhere in the world there was a place where she would matter. She had found it. Not because the world was kind. The world was not kind. The world was Aunt Prudence and Dalton Mercer and Silas Crane and the silence of people who watch violence and turn away. The world was fists and fire and the knowledge that some doors once opened reveal rooms full of ashes. But the world was also this porch, these mountains. These men who had pulled her from the dust and said, "You'll stand with us," and meant it with every scarred and calloused and gentle fiber of their being. These children and grandchildren running through wildflowers in a valley that had once held nothing but grief, their laughter the living proof that broken things can be mended and burned ground can bloom again. Wren Ashford had arrived in the mountains as a frightened orphan with nothing but hope and a letter. Wren Thornton stood on her porch as a wife, a mother, a grandmother, a partner, a survivor. The heart of a family forged in fire and love. The center around which 3 mountain men had learned to live again. Coming, Caleb asked, offering his hand. Wren took it. His hand was older now. The scars faded to silver, the calluses worn smooth in places. But it was still the hand that had lifted her from the dirt. Still the hand that had built this house. Still the hand that held hers every evening on this porch while the sun went down and the mountains stood watch, and the world, for all its cruelty, continued to offer moments so beautiful they justified every scar required to reach them. Coming, she said. They walked inside together. To the table, to the family, to the meal that was waiting prepared by hands that had learned from Wren's hands, which had learned from Ruth Thornton's memory, which lived on in biscuits that tasted like home and love, and the stubborn refusal to let the best things die. The door closed behind them, not against the world, just against the evening cold. Just 2 people walking into warmth and light, and the sound of family, and the circle of dinner, and the knowledge earned through fire and blood, and 30 years of daily choosing each other that this was enough. This was everything. And outside the mountains stood, as they had always stood, patient and vast and indifferent to the small human stories played out on their slopes. But if mountains could speak, these mountains might have said what the story itself had been saying all along, that the strongest thing in the world is not stone or steel or the fury of violent men. It is the decision made every morning by ordinary people in ordinary rooms to love someone despite the mata, to stand beside them despite the danger, to build despite the certainty that what you build can burn, to stand together no matter what comes. That the mountains would say is the only thing that lasts. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. If this story moved you, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from tonight. Subscribe if you haven't already. I'll be back next week with another frontier tale of love and courage, and the kind of people who refuse to stay down when the world tries to knock them flat. Until then, stand tall.